Hello friends, I am Mr. Ghost, and I am here to help you today. I know, you use these videos to fall asleep. So, before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from, and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable, and relax. I got a letter on a dull afternoon. It showed up in my mailbox without warning, a worn envelope with my name spelled out in careful handwriting. Inside was a short note that said I'd inherited an old chalet in the mountains, left to me by distant relatives I barely knew. I never expected to see anything from that side of the family. They'd faded from my life a long time ago, and I never had a reason to look back. But the letter was clear. I was now the owner of an isolated place in a region I'd never visited. I decided to go check it out. Maybe I was just curious, or maybe I thought I could sell it. Whatever my reasons were, I packed a bag and hit the road. When I finally arrived, the sun was dipping behind the tall peaks. The sky was a mix of dark blue and gray, and the air felt cold on my face. The chalet sat on a patch of land that overlooked a valley. It looked old, with cracked wooden steps, chipped paint, and a roof that might have had holes in it. I noticed broken shutters. The yard around it was full of weeds and dry patches of grass. There was a narrow path leading up to the front door. It looked like nobody had set foot there for years, but the letter said otherwise. I stopped near the front porch and switched off my car engine. The sudden silence made me uneasy. There were no birds singing, no wind blowing through the trees, nothing. I grabbed my bag and walked up to the porch. Each step creaked the boards, and I caught a whiff of something like old wood and dust. I turned the key that came with the letter and forced the door open. It got stuck about halfway and I had to shove it with my shoulder to get in. The inside was dark except for some light from the windows. I fumbled for a switch on the wall, managed to turn on a single overhead bulb, and it flickered, lit up a narrow hallway. The walls were stained, and there was a faint smell of dampness. I took a few steps in, and my shoes left prints on a thin layer of dust. Then I saw something odd. There were other footprints. They looked recent, like someone else had been there not long before me. They trailed off toward a room on the right. I followed them and found myself in what looked like a living room. There was a fireplace made of stone in the corner. It looked cold, full of old ashes. A ragged couch sat across from it, and there were a few chairs scattered around. The footprints led right into the center of the room and seemed to disappear near the fireplace. I bent down to get a closer look, feeling a chill on the back of my neck. The dust had been disturbed in that spot, and it looked like someone or something had been standing there, but there were no further prints leading out. I felt a tight knot in my stomach. I set my bag down on the couch, raised the lights if possible, and walked around the room. There were shelves with old books and a few knickknacks. Everything had a thin coat of dust except for some strange streaks that looked like they'd been wiped clean. I couldn't tell why. I brushed my fingers over the surface of one shelf, and the dust clung to my skin. Then I heard a soft thump behind me, like someone tapping on a piece of wood. I spun around, but there was no one there. My first night in the chalet started quietly enough. I found a small bedroom upstairs that looked like it had the least amount of dust. I set my suitcase on a chair, opened the window a crack to let in some fresh air, and pulled off the dusty sheets from the bed. I kept expecting to find some old family photos or personal items, but the drawers were mostly empty. The closet had a few moth-eaten jackets. I flicked on a lamp in the corner. The light was weak, but it helped me see a little. At around midnight, I woke up to a popping sound like wood burning. I realized the air felt warmer. I sat up and looked across the room. There was a faint glow coming from somewhere downstairs. My heart pounded, and my mouth went dry. I got out of bed, reached for my flashlight, and crept down the stairs. The glow was coming from the living room. When I turned the corner, I saw flames flickering in the fireplace. Even though I never lit it, the wood inside looked fresh. Heat radiated across the room. I felt it on my face. I checked the floor around the fireplace. The footprints I saw earlier were now gone, replaced by fresh ashes and bits of wood. It seemed like someone had started a fire. My hands were shaking a little. I grabbed a poker and stirred the logs, trying to figure out who could have done this. I stood there for a few minutes watching the flames dance. Eventually, I decided to wait it out. I let the fire burn itself down. I went back upstairs but left my bedroom door open. I didn't sleep well after that. In the morning, I woke up with a stiff back and a mild headache. The fire in the living room was out. leaving only cold ashes. I went outside to get some air. The sun lit up the mountains, and the scenery was impressive, but I felt uneasy. I hadn't seen any signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no doors unlocked except the front door. I decided to spend the day checking the rest of the chalet. Maybe I'd find some clue about who was coming in and out. The place had 2 floors and a small basement. On the second floor, aside from my bedroom, there were 2 more rooms. One looked like a study. It had a desk with some papers strewn about, a couple of chairs and a large bookshelf filled with old tomes. I flipped through the papers on the desk. Most were old documents about property boundaries and land ownership. I found references to family names I recognized vaguely from stories I'd heard when I was a kid. One sheet mentioned the chalet needing repairs due to moisture damage. I saw no mention of anyone else living here or watching the place. In the other room, I discovered a series of portraits on the walls. They were old, with darkened varnish. They showed men and women dressed in formal clothes. Their expressions were blank, and their eyes seemed to follow me no matter where I stood. I stepped closer to one portrait, noticing a resemblance around the nose and jawline to my grandfather. I could see the brushstrokes. The face looked stern, and the painted eyes seemed fixed on me. I felt a cold sensation in my chest. I touched the frame. It wobbled a bit as if hung on a weak nail. Downstairs, I explored the kitchen and a small dining area. The kitchen had old appliances that probably hadn't worked for decades. Cabinets were full of dusty cans and dishes that looked like they'd been sitting there forever. In the dining area, there was a large table with chairs around it. The tablecloth was stained, and the entire room smelled faintly of old cooking oil and stale air. I noticed one chair was pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there recently. That same tension returned to my chest. As the afternoon wore on, I thought about leaving, but also felt compelled to stay. This was my inheritance, for better or worse. Plus, I wanted to know what was going on. Maybe someone was squatting there. Maybe I was just jumpy. I decided to check the basement before calling it a day. The door to the basement was near the kitchen. It creaked when I opened it, and a musty smell floated up. I found a light switch. A single bulb lit the stairs going down. The basement wasn't large. I saw a workbench with tools scattered around and some old crates stacked against the walls. My flashlight beam flickered over the concrete floor. I didn't see any footprints down there, but I did see a set of metal hooks hanging from the ceiling. Maybe for drying meat or something similar. There were more boxes in one corner, labeled with dates and names. I recognized some of them as family members. I opened a couple of boxes. They contained old photographs, letters, and dusty keepsakes. I quickly flipped through them and felt an uneasy weight in my stomach. Every single item seemed connected to people I barely remembered. Their faces stared up at me from faded pictures, always with that same distant, silent look. I stayed down there longer than I meant to. By the time I returned upstairs, the sun was low again. I decided to set up a small dinner for myself, even if it was just a can of soup. I found some matches and tried to get the stove to work. The burner clicked, and after a few tries, I got a weak flame going. I heated the soup and ate it straight from the pot, leaning against the kitchen counter, listening for any sound from the rest of the chalet. It was quiet, almost too quiet. That evening, I lit a few candles in the living room, because the single light bulb flickered annoyingly. I sat on the couch, letting the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. My eyes kept drifting to the fireplace. It was empty now, but I felt a shiver run through me, remembering how it had lit up on its own the night before. I decided not to go to bed too early. I wanted to stay alert. Around 9, I heard a soft scrape near the front door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hall. There was nothing there, just the front door closed in the dim hallway light. Then I heard a low creaking sound from the floor above me, like someone stepping on a loose board. I clenched my fists and looked up, half expecting to see a face staring down from the landing. But all I saw was darkness. My pulse felt loud in my ears. I climbed the stairs one step at a time. Each board groaned under my weight. When I reached the hallway on the second floor, I felt a chilly draft. The door to the room with the portraits was open, even though I thought I'd left it closed. The portraits were still there, hanging in a row. My flashlight beam passed over each face. As I moved closer, I noticed something on the floor. A faint set of footprints in the dust, as if a bare foot had stepped there. They led straight to one of the portraits in the corner. the one of a middle-aged man with short hair and a rigid posture. I approached the portrait, my stomach twisted. The footprints stopped right at the wall directly under the painting. I reached out to touch the bottom edge of the frame, and it tilted forward. Behind it there was a small compartment in the wall. I swallowed hard and pushed the portrait aside. Inside the compartment I found a leather-bound journal, and a tiny key attached to a piece of twine. The journal's cover felt stiff and cold. I flipped through a few pages, scanning shaky handwriting. It mentioned family secrets, references to old traditions, and repeated mentions of something the writer called the family's debt. I spotted a line that said he must return here when the time is right. My hand started to shake again. I put the journal in my pocket and took the key. Then I heard another creak in the hallway. The door to the next room seemed to move by itself, just a small shift, like a draft pushing it. I stared at it, my heart thumping, but I forced myself to walk out. I needed air. I hurried down the stairs and went to the front porch. Outside, the air was crisp and cold. My breath came in quick bursts. I stood there looking at the dark outlines of the mountains. My thoughts were racing. Who lit the fire? Who left those footprints? Why did that journal mention me or somebody like me? The chalet felt alive in a disturbing way. I didn't hear any animals, didn't see any neighbors' lights in the distance. It was just me and that unsettling house behind me. After a few minutes I went back in, locked the door, and double-checked the windows. I returned to the living room. Trying to calm myself, I focused on my breathing. The candles had burned low, leaving a weak light. I grabbed the journal and opened it again. The pages were filled with notes about family gatherings, hidden documents, and cryptic remarks about a presence in the chalet. The writer mentioned hearing footsteps, voices, and seeing furniture move. He spoke about an old promise that had to be honored. I sat there flipping through those pages, feeling my pulse slow down a bit. Then I heard a dragging sound coming from above me. It was like a chair being pulled across the floor. I stood up fast, almost knocking over a candle. I grabbed the flashlight and ran upstairs again, calling out, "Is anyone here?" My voice echoed in the corridors. No reply. The chair and study had been moved. It now sat in the middle of the room, facing the doorway. The seat was covered in dust, but the floor around it looked recently disturbed, as if someone had pushed it into that position. I backed out of the room, deciding I was done for the night. I returned to my bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. I set the journal on the bedside table and slid the small key under my pillow. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every time the chalet creaked or settled, I froze. My mind kept returning to those footprints in the hidden compartment. Eventually I drifted off, but my sleep was shallow. By the third night, tension felt heavier. Things were moving around more often. Doors opened when I'd closed them. Footsteps thudded in empty rooms. The fireplace lit itself again at odd hours. I was jumpy, sweating at the slightest sound, even though the air was cold. It felt like the entire place was watching me. I kept hearing faint whispers, but I couldn't tell if they were real or just my nerves. Each time I walked by those portraits, I felt my spine tighten. Their eyes seemed locked on me. I kept the journal close, trying to piece together why this was happening. There was a passage that mentioned those who inherit must answer the call. I didn't understand what the call was. I just knew I wasn't alone here. Something was trying to get my attention. On the fourth night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door rattling. The doorknob turned slowly, but the lock held. I jerked upright, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move. The door stopped rattling after a few seconds, and I heard light footsteps retreating down the hallway. I realized then that I couldn't keep ignoring this. The presence wasn't just a distant feeling anymore. It was right outside my door. I'm still here in this chalet. I don't know if I can leave without figuring out what it wants from me. The nights are getting worse, and every day I find more evidence that something walks these corridors. I feel it in the shift of the floorboards and see it in the way objects keep changing places. I'm going to keep investigating, even though I'm scared. This place doesn't feel completely hostile, but it's not friendly either. It's like it's waiting for me to understand something. I don't know what that is yet, but I have this gut feeling that the chalet won't let me go until I figure it out. I still remember the first time I put my hand on that heavy wooden door. It was late afternoon, and the last rays of sunlight made the cracked facade of the old cathedral look even more worn. I'd walked by that building all my life, always seeing the doors locked and the windows dark. For some reason that day the front gate was left slightly open. I felt my pulse quicken. As a devout man I had always been, and I couldn't resist the pull I felt from inside. I pushed on the door without thinking much about it. The hinges made a grinding noise. My mind raced with questions, but I kept going. As soon as I stepped inside, I noticed how cold and stale the air felt. Everything looked abandoned. Dust coated the pews. Some of them had entire sections missing from rot. The walls showed dark spots where paint had peeled off. A faint smell of burnt candles and old incense lingered, giving me a strange sense of unease. I closed the door behind me, and the echo seemed to bounce around the empty space. I tried to stay calm, but my breathing got shallow and my heartbeat was a little harder than usual. This was a place of worship once, but now it felt more like a forgotten chamber, where shadows seemed to heave in every corner. I took a few steps forward, trying not to make any noise. My shoes scraped against loose tiles on the floor. When I paused, I heard something very soft. It sounded like a whisper in Latin. I don't speak Latin fluently, but I can pick up a few words. However, I couldn't make sense of it. It sounded far away, yet it also felt uncomfortably close. I glanced around for anyone, but the entire nave looked empty. The echo died quickly, leaving me unsure if I'd really heard anything at all. I told myself it must have been the wind. I spotted a small side door that seemed to lead to a narrow hallway. The hallway was dim, with only a few broken light fixtures in the ceiling. The walls were lined with religious portraits, their frames chipped and their images darkened by time. My footsteps felt unnaturally loud there. I tried to look at each portrait, but the gloom made it difficult to see. I kept moving until I reached what looked like a side chapel or maybe an old confessional area. There were several wooden confessionals arranged against the wall. Their doors were half open or hanging off the hinges. Everything smelled musty, and the wood creaked with every movement I made. My skin felt clammy, and a shiver ran through me even though I wore a warm jacket. I leaned in to look inside one of the confessionals. The old seat was torn, and there were stained papers on the small shelf. Some were so faded that I couldn't read them. A few had Latin phrases that I recognized, things like Domine and Miserere. I felt an unexpected sense of dread, as if I was intruding on a secret that wasn't meant for me. I reached for a small bundle of notes, tucked behind the broken kneeler. My hands trembled a bit. I read a few lines that described sightings of a bright figure near the altar. The notes mentioned sudden flashes of light, faint chanting, and people hearing footsteps when no one was there. One note included a date from decades ago, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Another note said something about hearing voices in the darkness, voices that spoke about personal sins. I found my mouth going dry. I wanted to put them back and leave, but curiosity held me in place. I kept reading. Most of the notes talked about a presence in the cathedral that knew confessions before they were spoken. One writer claimed they heard their own secrets whispered in the aisles. Someone else wrote that they felt something brush against their shoulder when they prayed. My stomach tightened, and my nerves tingled. I believed in the power of faith, but this felt off. It didn't sound like the normal hush of a holy place. It felt invasive and charged with something I couldn't explain. I refolded the papers and set them down where I found them, not sure if I should take them or leave them. Ultimately, I left them there because I didn't want to provoke whatever was inside this place. I went deeper into the cathedral, crossing the nave again. I tried to keep my footsteps quiet, but I kept stumbling on uneven stones. Every scrape and thump echoed. I heard more whispers. They were faint, but they were definitely there. They felt like they were coming from the walls themselves. I stopped, held my breath, and listened. The whispers paused, and then I heard my name spoken very softly. My shoulders tensed, and I broke into a sweat. I'm not used to hearing my name in an empty building. I called out to see if someone was hiding, maybe messing with me, but no one answered. I scanned the pews looking for any sign of movement. A few of the wooden benches made gentle creaking sounds, like someone was shifting their weight. My heart pounded. I knelt behind one pew, trying to steady my nerves, and peered between the seats. Everything looked deserted. I stood up and felt a jolt in my chest when the overhead lights flickered for a second. Then the place was dark again, except for a small amount of light that streamed in from the stained glass windows high above. I heard that soft Latin chanting once more. I forced myself to move forward, focusing on the central aisle that led to the altar. The altar was covered in dust. The cloth that used to be white was now gray. Tall candle holders leaned at odd angles. The space was silent, but I felt a strange pressure in my ears, as though something was building up. I reached out and brushed the surface of the altar with my hand. A thin layer of grime clung to my fingertips. The stone beneath felt cold and rough. Then I heard the whispers again, louder this time, still speaking in Latin. My name was in there, along with words like confess and repent. My throat tightened. I wanted to respond, but I couldn't form the words. Suddenly, I felt a breeze cut through the cathedral. The door behind me was closed, and the windows were high up and shut. Yet, the breeze felt strong enough to ruffle my clothes. I felt a chill along the back of my neck. I turned quickly and saw a flicker of light near the last pew. It lasted less than a second, but it looked like a faint glow, almost human-shaped. I froze. The hair on my arm stood up, and my knees felt weak. I stared at that spot for what felt like a long time, but nothing else appeared. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I finally let out a shaky exhale. My mind raced. Part of me wanted to run out of there and never come back. Another part of me felt compelled to figure out what was going on. I closed my eyes for a moment, said a short prayer for guidance, then opened them again. The space looked the same, old and decaying, but somehow still filled with a heavy presence. I decided to leave that day, but I also knew I'd return. Something was pulling me, and I couldn't fight the need to know more. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about the cathedral. I tried to focus on my normal routines, going to work and attending my usual church services, but my mind kept drifting back to the whispers and the glowing figure. I started having trouble sleeping. My dreams were filled with images of the dusty pews in the side hallways. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, sure I'd heard my name echoing in my room. After a few nights of this, I decided to go back. I told myself I needed proof that I wasn't losing my grip. When I entered the cathedral the second time, I noticed the temperature felt even colder. I flipped a light switch near the door, but nothing happened. I brought a small flashlight. The beam illuminated the aisles in narrow slices, revealing more broken tiles, cobwebs, and piles of old bulletins scattered on the floor. The building felt deserted, but I sensed that I wasn't alone. I heard faint rustling near the confessional, so I walked in that direction, stepping as quietly as I could. Inside the confessional area, I found more old notes. One was newer than the others. It mentioned voices that know my faults, and an unseen force demanding my confessions. I felt sweat form on my forehead. The note was signed with initials, but I couldn't read them clearly.
I heard a soft creak behind me.
I spun around, shining my flashlight on the floor and walls, but nothing was there. Then the whispers came back, as if they were floating through the corridors. My heart thumped, and my stomach twisted. I stayed quiet, listening. The whispers became more distinct, and I heard my name again. They spoke of regrets I barely ever acknowledged. They brought up sins I never spoke out loud, things I did when I was younger, decisions that weighed on me. My head spun. I felt the blood drain from my face. I shouted, demanding whoever was there to show themselves. Only silence answered me, except for the echo of my own voice. My hands trembled, and I clenched my flashlight so hard my knuckles hurt. I moved back toward the altar, certain that if anything was going to appear, it would be there. The atmosphere felt thicker, as though I was walking against a heavy current. My breathing got tighter. My pulse hammered in my ears. I reached the altar and aimed my flashlight around. For a split second, I saw that glow again. It was right near the tabernacle. I tried to steady my hand, but the flashlight was shaking. The figure vanished, leaving only dust motes in the air. This time I decided to speak. I'm here. I don't know what you want, but I'm here. I felt stupid talking to an empty space, but I kept going. I'm sorry if I've disrespected this place. The wind picked up again, swirling around the altar, and I thought I heard chanting under my feet, like it was coming through the floor. My mouth went dry, and I struggled to swallow. A voice whispered, "Confess." It was so close that I almost dropped the flashlight. I backed away, unable to find the words. My mind flashed with memories of every transgression I'd tried to bury. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling my heart slam against my ribs. I apologized again, speaking in a shaky voice. Then the chanting died down. I waited, unsure if I should continue. After a few minutes of painful silence, I turned and hurried out of there. I left the cathedral feeling drained and unsettled. Over the next week, I found myself returning 4 more times. Each time the whispers grew more insistent, I tried to talk back, but the voices demanded more personal confessions. They named specific events, things I'd done years ago. They spoke about moments when my faith had wavered. I could barely handle it. My chest tightened each visit, and I left feeling lightheaded and nauseous, yet I couldn't stop going back because I wanted to understand why this was happening. By the fifth visit, the place felt almost alive. Doors that I had left open were shut when I came back. Pews that were in one spot had shifted slightly, as if someone had been moving them. I heard footsteps echo behind me, but whenever I spun around, there was no one there. I found more notes stuffed in random places, all describing experiences similar to mine. A few lines said people heard voices calling them by name. Others mentioned glimpses of bright shapes near the altar. No one mentioned seeing any actual person. It was always just that glow and those voices. At this point, my health was suffering. I wasn't sleeping well and I couldn't focus at work. My friends asked if I was feeling sick, and I lied, saying I just had a cold. I tried to pray in my regular church, hoping to find some peace, but my mind kept drifting to that abandoned cathedral. I started to suspect that something beyond my understanding resided there and targeted people's weaknesses. I'm not a man who sees signs everywhere, but I couldn't deny the effect it had on me. I planned one last trip. I intended to say whatever I needed to say, then leave and never come back. I went in the late afternoon again because I didn't want to be there at night. This time I carried a small cross in my pocket and wore a heavier jacket to fight the cold. Once inside, I felt an immediate chill that cut straight through the layers of clothing. The cathedral was darker, and the faint light from outside barely reached the pews. I made my way to the altar. I stood there facing the dusty cloth in the old candle holders. I forced myself to look straight ahead. My voice shook, but I spoke out loud. I confessed everything I could remember, every sin that weighed on me, every doubt I ever felt. I listed them without any flowery language. I just said what I'd done. My palms were sweaty, and my legs felt like they might give out. The chanting started again, this time louder, circling around me. My ears rang and my body was tense. The air felt heavy, pushing down on my shoulders. I forced myself to keep talking, to keep admitting my faults. The voices roared, then abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was so thick I heard my own heartbeat. For a second I thought I saw that glow right in front of me. It seemed brighter. My eyes burned from not blinking. Then it vanished into the darkness. I stayed there for a minute or two, breathing hard and my mind racing. I felt a slight sense of release in my chest, like a tight knot had loosened. There were no more whispers. I listened carefully but heard only my own breathing. The air still felt cold, but I sensed that whatever was in this place had accepted what it wanted from me. I walked slowly back to the entrance without looking over my shoulder. I stepped outside into the late afternoon light and shut the door firmly. Since that day, I haven't gone back. Sometimes when I pass by the cathedral, the door is locked again. The windows are dark, and the place looks as abandoned as ever. I don't know if others still hear the whispers or see the glow. I only know that when I stopped running from what was inside me, the voices lost their hold. Still, I feel uneasy whenever I walk by, as if a cold presence is watching me, waiting. My faith is still there, but it feels more fragile than before. I can't forget the sound of that voice calling my name. I don't think I ever will. I noticed something strange on my first day in that old studio. The hallway smelled like wet cement and stale cigarettes. I had a tight feeling in my chest when I opened the door. The overhead light flickered for a moment before staying on. The walls were higher than I expected, with dark stains that trailed from the ceiling to the floor. The sound of the door closing behind me felt heavier than usual. I stood there with my bag of brushes and tubes of paint, trying to ignore a slight ringing in my ears. I wanted a cheap place that gave me space to work. I told myself I could handle some cracks and a little dampness, but something about those walls made the back of my neck tense up. The studio was one large room with a cement floor and a single window on the far side. The window overlooked a narrow alley, and I could hear the occasional echo of a car passing by on the street. I set down my supplies in the corner. My plan was to organize them later. I walked around checking the walls for any major leaks. I pushed on a few suspicious spots, feeling the rough surface of the plaster. Some areas had patches of mold, but I thought I could clean them. I just wanted to set up my easels and start painting as soon as possible. I didn't focus on the odd shapes the stains made. They looked like silhouettes, but I brushed that off as random water damage. That night, I dragged in my canvases and arranged them around the center of the studio. I set up an old desk for my brushes and paints. I placed a small lamp there, since the overhead light was too harsh for my taste. I could hear the squeaking of the floorboards when I moved around. I could also hear soft creaking sounds from the walls. I told myself it was just the building settling. I stood in front of an empty canvas for a few seconds, hoping for some kind of spark. Instead, I felt a strange chill. I glanced around to check if any windows were open. I saw nothing out of place, so I tried to focus on the blank canvas. I started sketching rough outlines with a piece of charcoal. My hand felt unsteady, and my mind wandered. I kept glancing at the far wall, expecting to see something move. I stopped drawing a few times to look more closely. The cracks in the wall seemed deeper. When I angled the lamp differently, I thought I saw faint shadows that didn't match my own position. I took a step back, rubbed my eyes, and decided I was just tired. I left the canvas blank for the night and lay down on a small cot I had set up near the corner. My ears picked up every little noise, pipes clanking, distant footsteps in the hallway, the hiss of the radiator. I didn't sleep well, and I woke up twice, convinced there was someone near the window. The next morning, I woke up with a stiff neck and a strange sense of urgency. My eyes felt gritty, and I had a mild headache. I made a quick cup of coffee on a small electric burner. The taste was bitter, but I drank it to clear my head. I stared at the canvas again, thinking I needed to create something fresh. I squeezed out some paint, mixed a few colors on my palette, and started applying broad strokes. My style is usually abstract, but this time I found myself painting something that looked vaguely human.
I didn't plan that. My brush moved on its own.
I tried to break free and switch to a different shape, but the paint kept forming the outline of a figure. I heard a soft scrape behind me. I turned around, heart pounding, but saw only the tall stained walls. I walked over and placed my palm against a spot where the plaster was cracked. It felt cold and slightly damp. I heard a faint dripping sound overhead. I checked the ceiling but noticed only more stains. When I went back to the canvas, the shape I had painted looked different from what I remembered. Its arms seemed to stretch toward the left edge as if it moved. I shook my head and thought maybe I'd misread my own brush strokes. I dipped my brush in water, wiped it clean, and continued painting. By midday, I had a rough figure on the canvas that didn't feel right to me. It had hollow features, no real details in the face, just the suggestion of eyes and a mouth. I felt uneasy each time I looked at it. The painting seemed to look back. I stood there tapping my foot, anxious about my own reaction. I tried to focus on mixing more paint, but my hands shook. I felt the hair on my arms stand up like the air was charged. Late that afternoon, I left the studio to buy more supplies. Walking out, I noticed how the hallway lights were dim and flickering. The other doors on that floor were closed. I never heard any sounds from my neighbors, which felt odd for such an old building. I took the stairs down the steps, echoing with each footstep. Outside, the air felt fresh, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I grabbed some paints and new brushes, then picked up a quick meal to bring back. I had a tight feeling in my stomach the entire time, like I was reluctant to return. When I got back, the studio felt darker. The overhead light still worked, but the corners of the room seemed shadowy. I placed my bag of supplies on the desk and approached the canvas. I froze when I saw the figure. Its position had changed again. The arm pointed in a different direction, as if it was beckoning me to the far wall. I stepped closer, my heart racing, and touched the paint. It was dry. I stepped back and looked around the room to see if maybe I had bumped the canvas or angled it differently. Nothing seemed out of place. I swallowed, trying to calm myself, and remembered a few times in my life when I'd been spooked by my own imagination. I told myself this was the same kind of situation. As night approached, I set my lamp on a side table and adjusted it so it lit up the wall I planned to paint next. I wanted to ignore the first canvas for a while and start a new piece. I placed a fresh canvas on another easel and tried to distract myself with broad strokes of color, but my mind kept drifting. I kept glancing over my shoulder to see if that figure on the first painting had shifted again. Every time I looked, my chest tightened. I could feel sweat on my palms. I wiped them on my pants and forced myself to keep painting. Around 10 p.m., I heard a soft knock at the door. I froze and stared at the handle, expecting it to turn. It never did. There was no voice, no further sound. I couldn't bring myself to open the door and check. My breath felt shallow. I grabbed a rag to wipe the paint from my fingers, then stood there listening. The silence in the hallway pressed on my ears. I felt an urge to open the door and make sure nobody was there, but a stronger urge kept me in place. After a few minutes, I tried to shake off the tension and return to my second canvas. At some point, I must have dozed off while sitting at the desk. I woke up to a faint scraping noise near the window. My eyes flew open, and I looked toward the glass. I saw a dark shape pass by like a brief shadow. I thought it could have been someone walking in the alley. I stood up and approached the window, but I only saw the empty alley below. A rusted fire escape was on the side of the building. No one stood there. I noticed the dryness in my mouth and took a sip of water from a glass on the desk. I realized the lamp was off. I don't remember turning it off. The overhead light was still on, casting a harsh glow across the floor. My heart pounded as I looked at the first painting. The figure had moved again. Its arms were now outstretched, and there were two faint shapes behind it. I felt a wave of cold fear in my chest. My vision felt shaky. I walked towards the painting, reaching out to touch it. The paint felt solid, but the shapes looked alive. I stared at them, feeling sweat trickle down my back. The next day, I tried to keep a routine. I woke up early, took a quick shower in the shared bathroom down the hall, and ate a small breakfast at a nearby diner. I hoped daylight would ease my nerves. I returned to the studio with some fresh ideas in mind, trying to push away the fear I felt. The moment I stepped inside, I smelled something musty like old rags. The room felt heavier. I opened the window to let in some air, but the alley breeze carried a sour smell. I closed it again, deciding to ignore the odor. I set up another canvas. I forced myself to paint something bright, maybe a landscape. My brushstrokes were shaky, but I managed a few layers of color. Then I heard a soft whisper from somewhere behind me. It sounded like someone saying my name. I whipped around, but I saw nobody. My hands started trembling. I dropped the brush on the floor. Wet paint spattered on my shoes. I cursed under my breath, grabbed a rag and bent down to wipe it. A sense of dread pressed on me, and I felt a sudden urge to leave, but I stayed, refusing to let fear control me. In the afternoon, I heard someone walking upstairs. I listened to the footsteps overhead. They paced back and forth a few times, then stopped. I waited for them to resume, but the silence remained. I looked up at the ceiling and wondered who was in the room above. The caretaker told me most of the building was empty, but I felt uneasy. My mind was racing with thoughts of someone sneaking around. When I checked the hallway, it was quiet. No one was there. That evening, I felt drained. I sat on the cot and stared at the walls. The stains almost formed outlines of faces. I told myself I was tired and hungry. I cooked some instant noodles on my electric burner and ate in silence. The radiator hissed from time to time, and the overhead light still flickered. My second painting looked incomplete, and the first painting seemed to dominate the room. The figure's features were more defined now. I could see the suggestion of eyes. They seemed to track me when I moved. I decided to try a different approach. I wanted to paint over the figure entirely. I grabbed a large brush and a thick coat of white paint. I stood in front of the first canvas and began covering the shape. My hand shook while I worked. As I brushed over the face, I heard a low whisper. It was right next to my ear. I jumped and flung the brush at the canvas. It splattered paint across the figure's outline. The whisper stopped, but my heart hammered in my chest. I forced myself to continue. Layer after layer of white paint went on, but the figure never fully vanished. I could still see its outline beneath the surface. I finally backed away, out of breath. I wiped my forehead with the back of my hand. My heartbeat throbbed in my ears. I noticed the corners of the studio growing darker. The overhead light seemed dimmer. I flicked the switch a few times, but it only flickered more. I moved my lamp closer, but it made the space behind me feel even darker. I considered leaving, but I thought I needed to finish covering that figure. My determination felt like an obsession. I added more coats of paint, working faster and almost frantic. I heard faint sounds behind me, shuffling feet, muffled breathing. I spun around, with paint dripping from my brush, but saw no one. I felt my breathing get shallow, and my hand trembled. I stepped away from the easel, telling myself I could finish in the morning. I walked to the door, ready to leave for the night. As I reached the door, I felt a sharp chill on my neck, like someone exhaling against my skin. The hair on my arms prickled and my throat felt tight. I spun around, fists clenched. No one was there. I realized my entire body was shaking. The painting stood in the center of the room, like silent watchers. The first canvas still had that hidden outline beneath the white paint. The second canvas showed a twisted landscape, as if my fear had warped the scene. I felt dizzy, as if the walls were closing in. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. I made my way downstairs, each step echoing. I could feel my heart pounding as I reached the lobby. It was empty. The front door creaked when I pushed it open. Once I was outside, I took a few deep breaths. My hands were sweaty, and my mouth was dry. I walked around the block trying to calm down. My eyes darted at every sound. Someone dropping a bottle into a trash can, a car door slamming, distant chatter. I realized I was on edge, unsure if returning would be wise. After a few minutes, I told myself I needed to face this situation. I was paying rent for that studio, and I had a responsibility to finish my work. I re-entered the building, ignoring the sinking feeling in my stomach. I climbed the stairs with my hand trailing along the railing. The hallway lights buzzed faintly. I unlocked my door and stepped inside. I listened for any sound, but all I heard was my own breathing. I walked straight to the canvases. They looked the same as before, but I sensed a presence in the room. My skin tingled, and I had trouble focusing. I grabbed a clean brush and decided to paint something else. Maybe something simple, just to ground myself. I dipped the brush in black paint and made a few strokes on a fresh canvas. My thoughts were scattered. My pulse remained quick. I tried to create a shape of a room, maybe the studio itself. But I ended up painting vague figures again, almost against my will. They had distorted limbs and blurred features. I stopped when I felt a small vibration under my feet. It was like someone tapping on the floor from below. The caretaker said the basement was just storage. They knelt down and placed my ear to the concrete. I could hear a faint murmur like water pipes or possibly voices. My head started to throb. I stood up and checked my watch. It was past midnight. I decided to lie down on the cot and try to sleep, though I doubted I would rest. I must have slept at some point because I woke up to the sound of a canvas tipping over. I bolted upright and saw one of my paintings on the floor. The second canvas had fallen forward. I got up, rushed over, and lifted it back onto the easel. The paint was smudged where it hit the ground. My stomach churned. I touched the surface to see if it was still wet. It felt slick in some areas. I tried to steady my breathing. Then I noticed fresh streaks on the background, almost like finger marks. My hands were trembling, and I hadn't touched that painting with my fingers. I felt like the walls were closing in. My forehead burned with sweat. I decided I needed fresh air again. I grabbed my jacket, turned off the lights, and left the studio. I plan to come back tomorrow morning to gather my things. I'm not sure if I'll stay after that. These shadows aren't just illusions. They move. They change the paintings, and they don't let me rest. They want me to capture them on the canvas. They seem to demand attention, and I sense they want me to reveal whatever story they carry. I don't think they'll let me leave for good, but I also know I can't keep living in this constant fear. Right now, I'm standing outside the building, catching my breath. I can't stop looking up at the windows of my studio. The light is off, but I swear I see movement behind the glass. I feel a cold weight in my gut. My heart thuds in my chest. Tomorrow I'll go back in. Maybe I'll confront these presences. Maybe I'll paint until they're satisfied. I don't know if that will make them stop, but I can't walk away from this. I need answers. If they want to be seen, I'll paint them. If they want their stories told, I'll do my best to put that on the canvas. I just hope I can hold on to my sanity in the process, because right now I feel like I'm standing on the edge, and the shadows in that studio are pulling me in. I still remember the day I first stepped into that apartment. The hallway smelled like fresh paint and detergent. The previous tenants had left in a hurry, or so the landlord told me. The place looked clean enough, but there was a strange heaviness in the air. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. I'd been looking forward to a fresh start for weeks, and I wasn't about to let a weird mood sop me. My first night was quiet. I unpacked a few boxes, made a simple dinner, and went straight to bed. The next morning I noticed the mirror in the hallway had a bunch of smudges and handprints all over it. I thought maybe the landlord's cleaners missed that spot. I grabbed some glass cleaner and wiped every inch until it looked spotless. When I checked it, an hour later there were faint prints again. I ran my finger over them. They looked like greasy smears. I cleaned it one more time before leaving for work. That evening, I was heading to the bathroom when something caught my eye in the mirror. At first, I assumed it was just my reflection, but the movement looked out of sync. I was turning left, but it seemed like it turned a fraction of a second late. I took a step closer. My heart started beating faster. I tried to wave my hand. The reflection waved, but not perfectly in time. It felt like a glitch. I shook my head, thinking maybe I was just tired. The mirror showed my face with the same worried expression I had, so I shrugged it off and continued with my night. I'd clean the mirror daily, sometimes twice a day. Yet every time new handprints appeared, they always seemed to be in different spots. By the third day, I decided to test something. I cleaned it in the morning, walked away, then came back immediately to see if the prints returned right away.
They didn't.
But a few hours later, I checked again and there they were. More prints scattered across the surface. I tried not to panic, but it felt weird. My arms had goosebumps. I told myself maybe I had touched it by accident. Maybe it was my own hands. Yet I couldn't recall touching the mirror at all that day. That same evening, I was watching a movie in the living room, feeling half asleep on the couch, when I heard a faint whisper. It sounded like my name, but muffled, almost underwater. I muted the TV and looked around.
Nothing else made a sound.
My eyes locked onto the mirror down the hallway. The overhead light was off, so the corridor looked shadowy. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt drawn to it, like it was calling me. I walked slowly, my legs tense, my throat feeling dry. When I got close, I didn't see anything unusual. My reflection stood there looking nervous, but it moved when I moved. I let out a shaky breath and went back to the couch. I felt embarrassed for getting so worked up. The next day I started paying more attention to my reflections' timing. Sometimes it was perfect. Other times it lagged or moved in a slightly different rhythm. It was never obvious. It was more like a detail at the edge of my vision. Something that made my skin crawl. I tried blinking fast or rubbing my eyes, hoping it was some strain or a trick of the lighting. But the more I watched, the more convinced I became that my reflection had a mind of its own. One night I felt restless. I couldn't sleep, so I wandered into the hallway. The mirror was there, faintly lit by the light from the street lamp outside. I stood in front of it, looking at myself. I noticed the usual smudges again. They were shaped like open palms pressed onto the glass. My brain told me to wipe them off right away, but I decided to leave them there to see if anything changed overnight. I took a long breath and turned away. That was when I heard the whisper. It was impossible to tell if it came from behind the mirror or from my own head. It said, "Why did you come back?" My heart hammered against my ribs. I turned around fast, but my reflection looked normal, except for a slight tilt of the head. It was subtle, but I caught it. My reflection seemed to be leaning forward in a way I wasn't. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to ask what it meant, but I didn't open my mouth. I just stumbled back to my bedroom, shut the door, and left the lights on all night. The following morning, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection carefully. My cheeks felt hot. I was angry at myself for feeling so jumpy. I touched the mirror. The glass felt cold. My reflection touched it at the same time, but there was a tiny lag I couldn't ignore. I told myself to keep calm. Then I noticed something strange behind my reflection. It looked like a small table with a lamp I'd never seen before. I glanced over my shoulder, searching for a similar table in my hallway. I had no furniture there, just bare walls. But in the reflection, I definitely saw a lamp. My pulse pounded. I leaned in closer, and the reflection seemed to move at the same speed. But I could see that lamp more clearly now, resting on a piece of furniture that didn't exist in my apartment. All day at work, I felt distracted. My stomach was tight, and I kept fidgeting. I told myself I should just ignore the mirror and maybe replace it. But I also felt a nagging need to understand what was going on. That night, I tried a different approach. I stood in front of the mirror with my phone's flashlight aimed at the glass. I wanted to see if the angle of light made a difference. I didn't notice anything weird, except those same smudges that never went away for long. They were scattered in random patterns, like someone was pressing their hands all over the place. After 2 more days, I started questioning my own sanity. I even called a friend and told him I was feeling weird in my new place. I didn't mention the mirror because I was afraid he'd think I was losing it. I just said I felt uneasy and wasn't sleeping well. He offered to come by for a beer, but I declined. I had this feeling I needed to handle it alone, though I couldn't explain why. When I got off the phone, I went back to the hallway and stared at the mirror again. My reflection stared back with the same tense expression. Then I saw a slight shift in its eyes. It was like it was looking at me with a different intensity. My hands started sweating. I noticed that behind my reflection in that other space, a door was open. It led into a room that wasn't part of my apartment. I saw a hint of a living area with a couch that didn't match anything I owned. It sent shivers up my spine. I blinked several times, but it stayed there. I breathed hard and backed away. I locked myself in the bedroom and paced. My heart was beating out of control. I kept hearing the question in my mind, why did you come back? I tried to think if I had lived here before. I had never set foot in this building until I rented the place. So what did that question mean? Come back where? My mind darted through possibilities, but I forced myself to stop thinking. My forehead was damp, and I could smell my own sweat. I opened the window for fresh air. Cars passed below, and I took some comfort in the normal sounds of the city. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up thinking I heard tapping on the walls. And dawn came. I went straight to the mirror again, my heart racing. This time, I tried speaking to it. Is someone there? I asked. My voice echoed in the silent hallway. My reflection obviously repeated my lip movements, but there was that faint delay again. I leaned in. What do you want? I whispered. My reflection's lips moved, but I heard a raspy sound almost too soft to notice. I couldn't make out the words. My neck tingled, and the hair on my arms stood up. I clenched my fists to stop them from trembling. I grabbed a roll of tape from the kitchen and ran it along the edges of the mirror, thinking maybe it was loose and that was causing some weird reflection effect. But the mirror was firmly attached to the wall. I turned on every light in the hallway, hoping to remove any strange shadows that changed nothing. The weirdness stayed. Over the next few days, I tried ignoring the mirror. I'd rush past it without looking, or I'd take a different route through the apartment so I wouldn't have to see it. But I still felt its presence. The prints never stopped showing up. I find them in the morning, in the evening, whenever. They'd be at different heights, sometimes near the top edge, sometimes near the center, sometimes angled like a hand sliding across the glass. Each time my stomach would nod. I kept cleaning them, but they always returned. Eventually I couldn't take the tension anymore. One evening after work, I stood in front of the mirror and forced myself to watch my reflection. I tried to do every move slowly, raising my arm, lowering my arm, blinking, turning my head. The reflection followed, but always with that tiny difference in timing. My pulse throbbed in my temples. Then my reflection did something else. It lifted its left hand to its face while I kept my arms at my sides. My entire body froze. My mouth went dry. A sharp chill spread across my back. The reflection was acting on its own. I didn't know what to do, so I stayed there. My reflection ran its hand across its chin. Then it turned slightly and revealed that strange room behind it again. The same lamp, that unfamiliar couch. My legs felt weak, like they might buckle. I stepped back, terrified. My reflection stepped forward. It looked like it was about to come closer, which made no logical sense, but that's how it appeared. My breath came in ragged gasps. I forced myself to speak. Who are you? My voice cracked. The reflection mouthed something without sound. Its eyes looked locked on mine, but I heard no clear reply. Just a faint hiss like air escaping. I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed a blanket from the living room and tossed it over the mirror. My heart thudded. My arms felt stiff as I pressed the blanket's edges against the frame to block my own view. I didn't want to see it. I wanted it gone. That night I slept a little better, thinking I'd solved the problem by just covering it. But in the morning the blanket was on the floor. I tried to recall if I had woken up in a daze and removed it, but I didn't think so. My gut twisted with anxiety. Sure enough, the mirror was full of fresh prints, as though someone had pressed their palms against every corner of the glass. I swore under my breath and ran my hand through my hair. For a moment I considered removing the mirror from the wall completely, but it was huge, and I worry I'd damage the plaster. Also, part of me feared what I'd see if I actually got it off the wall. Instead, I went for a walk. I needed to clear my head. Outside, the sky was overcast, and a light drizzle fell. I smelled wet concrete. The normal sea of cars passing and people hurrying around gave me a brief escape. But every time I closed my eyes, I pictured that reflection moving in ways I wasn't. When I returned, I stood outside my own door for several minutes, bracing myself. Inside, the place felt different, colder. I noticed a slight draft near the windows, though I'd closed them before leaving. I tried the light switch in the hallway. The bulb flickered a bit, which it had never done before. I stared at the uncovered mirror. The blanket was still on the floor again. This time I picked it up and tucked it away in a closet. I decided it was pointless to cover it. Something was happening, and ignoring it wasn't working. I faced the mirror, taking a shaky breath. "All right," I muttered. "In here." The reflection looked calm, but it had that same odd timing. I saw that lamp again on the couch. I saw a shape move behind the couch. It was impossible to see details, just a dark outline. My head felt hot and my body broke out in a sweat. I blinked hard. It was still there. It didn't feel like a dream or a delusion. The shape seemed to walk out of my line of sight. Then I saw the reflection tilt its head as if it were listening to someone in that other room. I couldn't move. My thoughts were jumbled, but I knew I felt real terror. My throat tightened and my mouth tasted bitter. I heard that whisper again, so close it felt like it was right behind my ear. "Why did you come back?" My eyes darted to my reflection's mouth. I couldn't see the lips move. The voice felt closer than the mirror. The question made no sense, yet it felt personal. My breath shook. I wanted to answer, but I didn't know how. My reflection just watched me with tense eyes. Then I noticed something else on my reflection's face. A faint scratch under its jaw that I didn't have. I ran my fingers over my own skin. There was no mark, but the reflection's scratch looked red and raw, as if it had recently happened. My stomach lurched. I took a step toward the mirror, raising my hand to see if maybe I just couldn't feel it. But my skin was smooth. Still in the glass, I saw that scratch. I tried rubbing the mirror, thinking maybe it was a smear or some distortion, but I felt nothing but cold glass. The scratch stayed. My hand started shaking. I wanted out. I wanted to grab my keys and leave, but I felt glued to the spot, staring at that weird scratch. The non-existent furniture, the handprints, the slight movements that didn't match mine. The reflection leaned in closer until its face almost touched the glass. Its lips parted, and I heard a slow exhale from inside the mirror. That's when I realized I was holding my breath. I gasped for air, my heart pounding. I couldn't stand the tension, so I blurted out, "What do you want from me?" My voice echoed off the empty walls. Its lips moved, but I heard only a quiet rasp, like a whisper without words. My nerves felt like they were on fire. The reflection's eyes locked onto mine, and I noticed it was slightly off to one side, as if it were leaning out of perfect alignment with me. It was waiting. For what? I didn't know. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My reflection moved forward again, pressing its palms against the inside of the glass. I saw the hands line up with two of the prints. My pulse drummed in my ears. I squeezed my eyes shut, desperate for a second of relief, but I had no choice. I had to open them again. When I did, the reflection was just standing there, matching my stance, but I couldn't forget how it moved a second ago. I backed away from the mirror, turned, and rushed to the living room. I grabbed a chair and dragged it across the hallway, positioning it in front of the mirror. I sat down, heart still racing, determined to stay there as long as it took. I wanted to see if it would happen again. I waited, my eyes fixed on the glass. My back and neck started aching, and my eyes stung from staring so intensely. But I didn't want to move. I refused to let the reflection slip out of sync without me noticing. Minutes passed. An hour passed. My eyelids felt heavy. Then, just when I considered giving up, I saw that room behind my reflection start to light up. It looked like someone had turned on a lamp. My reflection didn't move. I couldn't see who was there, but I sensed a presence. My muscles tensed and I sucked in a sharp breath. I heard the same whisper clearer this time. "Why did you come back?" I jumped to my feet, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I gripped the edges of the mirror, leaning my face so close I could feel my own breath bouncing off the glass. "I never lived here before," I shouted, more out of desperation than anything. My reflection's eyes flared with a sudden intensity. Then, in a split second, it vanished. The mirror reflected only the empty hallway. No me, no lamp, no couch, just nothing. Like a plain piece of glass showing a boring corridor. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing. My body shook, my arms tingled, and sweat soaked the back of my shirt. Seconds later, my reflection reappeared with a slight ripple effect. As if the glass were a pool of water, my mouth hung open. The reflection stared, but it had that scratch on the jaw, that same disjointed timing. I couldn't handle it. I grabbed a towel, flung it over the mirror again, and ran into my bedroom. I locked the door. My mind raced. My body felt weak, and my head pounded. I sank onto my bed, pressing my palms to my face, struggling to catch my breath. I heard no more whispers, but I couldn't forget that question echoing in my mind. I don't know if I'll stay in this place. Every morning I wake up expecting more handprints, and I'm never disappointed. They're always there. Every night I hear that soft voice in the hallway, or maybe just in my head, asking me why I came back. I don't have an answer. I don't know what any of it means. I just know that mirror isn't normal. I see things in there that don't exist in my reality. I see myself, but not really me. And now I feel like I'm stuck on the wrong side of the glass, or maybe it's the right side. I'm not sure anymore. All I know is that I can't ignore it. Something is happening, and I can't escape the feeling that I'm trapped here, facing a version of myself I don't understand. I remember my first day in that old government building. I arrived early in the morning, hoping to finish my orientation quickly. The place looked normal enough from the outside. Gray walls, a few floors, tall windows, but people said there were tunnels underneath that stretched for hundreds of feet. They told me I would be spending most of my time down there, sorting through dusty boxes and filing records in a storage area nobody bothered with. I shrugged it off at first. I had worked in old basements before. I knew there would be poor lighting, stale air, and maybe a few insects. I just didn't realize how deep those tunnels went or how little light I would actually have. I reported to a small office on the first floor. A clerk gave me a list of boxes I needed to locate, log, and reorganize. He showed me a map of the basement. It had rows of shelving, small rooms for storage, and a large corridor that looped around several locked vaults. He also handed me a key ring and a flashlight. The flashlight was small and didn't look very powerful. I asked if there were spare batteries. He shook his head and said the supply closet was near the elevator on the basement level, if I needed anything else. Then he pointed to the door that led to the main staircase. I thanked him and started walking. The stairwell smelled like wet concrete. My footsteps echoed with each step, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. By the time I reached the basement floor, I could already feel my palms sweating. The air felt thick and stuffy, like there was no ventilation at all. Dim bulbs lined the hallway, but most of them seemed burnt out. I flipped on my flashlight and looked around. Old filing cabinets stood in rows, some with drawers missing or rusted shut. The walls had dark stains from years of water seepage, and the ground was uneven in places where the cement had cracked. There was a faint drip-drip sound somewhere in the distance. It sounded like water leaking through the ceiling. I followed the map until I found a wide corridor leading to a larger room full of metal shelves. The shelves were packed with old folders, books, ledgers, and random documents tied up with twine. I set down my bag, which had my own small notepad and pen, plus a binder for the catalog. I turned on the single overhead light in that section. It flickered for a second before casting a weak yellow glow across the shelves. Dust motes floated everywhere. Each breath felt heavy, and I could almost taste the mold in the air. I started my work by carefully opening the first few boxes. The labels were faded, so I had to shine my flashlight directly on them to make sense of the handwriting. I wrote down the reference numbers and titles on my notepad. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first, just old property records and permits from decades ago. But as I moved to the next row, I found a file that mentioned repeated repairs in the sub-basement level. It said the tunnels had structural problems, and there were reports of people hearing strange noises. I thought it was just old building stuff. Metal creaking, pipes expanding, nothing dramatic. After a couple of hours, I decided to explore more of the corridor. I shut off the overhead light to save power, relying on my flashlight. The silence down there was complete. It felt oppressive, like the darkness was pressing in around me. I listened to my own breathing. Then I heard something else. Slow, steady footsteps. At first, I thought it might be another worker, maybe a janitor or a security guard. But they didn't come closer. Instead, they seemed to move away and circle back. The sound echoed, so I couldn't be sure where it was coming from. I stood still and waited. My heart pounded in my chest. The footsteps faded, and I didn't see anyone. I told myself it was probably just the old pipes, or my own movement echoing around. The next day, I went back down with a bigger flashlight I brought from home. I also wore a light jacket because the basement felt damp. As soon as I turned the corner into the main corridor, I noticed fresh footprints on the dusty floor. They were partial, maybe from a boot or a heavy shoe. There was only one set, and it led deeper into the tunnels. I followed them out of curiosity for a few yards, but the footprints vanished where the floor was drier. I shook my head. It didn't make sense for there to be only one set of prints. Someone had to come down and then go back out the same way. But I didn't see a return trail. I tried to ignore it and focused on my catalog work. I found an old wooden desk with a few drawers. Inside, I discovered a small stack of reports from different years. Each one mentioned employees assigned to the sub-basement for maintenance or inventory. A few pages were marked with notes about unexplained disappearances. No one said they died, they just never showed up for work again. One report said a man left a half-finished sandwich in the break area and never returned to claim it. Another described a supervisor who locked the doors one night and was gone the next morning, leaving his keys on the floor. The handwriting on that note was shaky, and a line at the bottom mentioned a hooded figure seen near the tunnels. I frowned and set the reports aside. I felt a chill, even though the air was muggy. After a short break, I went to the far corner of the basement where older records were stored. The corridor there was darker, and the ceiling had spots of water damage that dripped onto the floor. I tried to keep my footsteps steady, but every little sound seemed to echo twice as loud in the darkness. My flashlight beam shook a bit because my hands felt tense. I wasn't sure why I was so on edge. The place just had a bad vibe. I opened one door labeled Archive Room D. The odor inside was musty, mixed with something else like old leather. A few boxes were stacked in a corner and a metal cabinet stood against the far wall. I heard a faint scuffling sound. I aimed my flashlight and saw a rat scurry across the floor. It disappeared through a gap in the wall. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. I spent most of the afternoon sorting through boxes, labeling them with new tags and writing notes about their contents. The tension in my shoulders kept building. Every few minutes, I'd stop to listen. Sometimes I'd hear a soft scrape, as if someone was dragging a shoe across the concrete. Other times, I'd pick up what sounded like a whisper. When I point my flashlight in that direction, I saw nothing but damp walls and old file boxes. My shirt clung to my back from sweat. My throat felt dry, and I didn't bring enough water. I decided to call it a day earlier than planned. On my third day, I tried to be systematic. I took the elevator down instead of the stairs, hoping I might run into someone else. The elevator was slow, and the doors creaked. When they opened, I was greeted by a stale breeze. I walked down the corridor, turned right, and saw flickering lights at the far end. I got closer and realized there was a small maintenance room with a single lamp hanging from the ceiling. A squeaky rolling cart full of cleaning supplies sat near the door, but no one was there. I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed back. No answer. I looked around for a note or a sign of a janitor, but found nothing. That cart looked recently used. There was a bucket half full of water. I didn't see any footprints around it though. The dust was undisturbed except for a few scuffs. I resumed my file work. Around midday, I discovered another stack of documents referencing the sub-basement. These were older typed reports about expansions of the tunnels. One sentence mentioned hidden passages connecting different wings of the building. Another included a rough diagram with a date from the night. I started to feel like I'd stumbled on something I wasn't supposed to see. The more I read, the more I noticed references to a hooded figure who showed up at random times, always near the deeper corridors. Employees described feeling watched. One line read, "Do not speak of what you've seen. Leave it in the dark." My stomach twisted. I placed the papers into a folder and slid them into my bag. I wanted to show them to the clerk upstairs, but I also felt a strong urge to keep reading. By the fourth day, I'd grown used to the smell and the poor lighting, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching me. Every time I turned a corner, I'd half expect to see a shadow or a figure down the hall. My nerves were raw. My heart rate spiked whenever I heard the slightest noise. I tried to reassure myself that it was just a creepy old basement, but it didn't help. I'd break out in a cold sweat whenever I heard footsteps. They would come and go, circling around me. Sometimes they'd sound so close that I'd spin around with my flashlight up, but I'd see nothing. That day, I ventured deeper into the tunnels than I had before. The corridor was lined with old, defunct lamps on the walls. My flashlight beam illuminated patches of moisture and greenish mold. The air was stale and thick. At one point I saw a locked steel door with an old plaque that read, "Archive Secure Vault." My keyring didn't open it, so I moved on. I felt a slight draft coming from somewhere, but I couldn't tell which direction. The corridor branched left and right, and my map didn't show that. I picked the right path and noticed the walls were rougher, less finished. This was more like a natural tunnel than a constructed hallway. I heard the footsteps again, steady and slow, matching my own pace. I stopped. They stopped. My stomach tightened. I called out, "Is anyone down here?" My voice echoed, and I heard water dripping. No answer. I took a few more steps, and the footsteps resumed. They sounded like they were right behind me, maybe 10 or 15 feet away, but I saw nothing when I turned. My hands started shaking. My breath came in short bursts. I could feel my pulse in my temples. I kept walking, shining my flashlight along the walls, looking for an opening or a room I could duck into. I found a small doorway and stepped inside. The footsteps continued past my hiding spot. I felt a wave of relief, mixed with a new sense of dread. Whatever it was, it had walked right by me. I waited another minute before stepping back into the corridor. I followed the corridor until I reached another set of steps leading down. According to old reports, there might be a lower level, but nobody had confirmed it in recent years. I shone my light down the steps. The stone looked worn, with cracks and water damage. Something about going even deeper felt wrong, but my curiosity was too strong. I took each step carefully, noticing the echo of my own movement bouncing off the walls. At the bottom, the corridor angled to the left. The air felt colder, which was odd because everywhere else had been muggy. I saw a faint light flickering around the bend. I approached slowly, hugging the wall. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I turned the corner and saw a faint glow coming from a wide archway. It was some sort of old storeroom, with shelves lining the walls. A single lantern flickered on a wooden crate. The flame was small, and the lantern looked decades old. I stepped closer, keeping my flashlight beam pointed ahead. Then I heard a soft shuffle behind me. I spun around, and there it was, a figure in a dark hood standing at least 6 feet away. I couldn't see a face. The figure didn't move or speak. They just stood there, blocking the corridor. My throat went dry. My legs tensed. My mind raced with a million questions. Was this a guard? A trespasser? Something else? I raised my flashlight to get a better look, and the figure backed away a step. I heard the faint scrape of their foot on the stone floor. I tried to say something, but the words caught in my throat. Finally, I managed to stammer, "Who are you?" No reply. The figure kept a steady posture. I inched backward, not taking my eyes off it. My flashlight flickered for a second, then steadied. The figure was gone, just like that. The corridor was empty. I hadn't heard any footsteps. I ran my flashlight beam over every inch of that spot. Nothing. My heart hammered so hard I felt a little dizzy. I turned around, grabbed the lantern off the crate, and realized it had almost no fuel. It sputtered and dimmed. I put it back down. The entire room smelled like old wax and damp wood. I decided it was time to leave. I hurried back the way I came. My footsteps were loud, and I didn't care if anyone heard. The footsteps following me started up again, but I didn't look back. My skin prickled with fear, as if something was right behind me. I made it to the stairs, climbed them 2 at a time, and bolted toward the elevator. I jabbed the button repeatedly, glancing behind me every few seconds. The corridor was empty. The elevator took forever to arrive, and the overhead light flickered as the doors opened. I stepped in, pressed the button for the ground floor, and tried to catch my breath. As the elevator rose, I replayed everything in my head. The footprints, the files about disappearances, the figure in the hood. I felt a rush of anxiety, but also a strong curiosity about what else those boxes might reveal. Something was lurking down there, and it didn't want me to see certain records. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being tested or watched. When the doors opened on the ground floor, I stepped out into the normal world, feeling disoriented. The hallway here was brightly lit, and I could hear distant conversations and phones ringing. It was a relief, but my heart was still racing, and I realized my shirt was soaked with sweat. I decided to stop at the clerk's office. I showed him a few of the documents mentioning the hooded figure and asked if he knew anything about them. His expression changed. He shook his head and told me I was better off minding my own business. He said the sub-basement was old and rumors always floated around. People get spooked, he said, avoiding my eyes. Just do your job and don't go poking around too much. I nodded, but I knew I couldn't let it go. Something about that place felt wrong, and I needed to find out what it was, even though I was terrified. I planned to go back down the next day. I couldn't leave those files unexamined. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the corridor. My heart would pound, and I'd jolt awake. My throat felt sore, and my legs ached from all the running. I tossed and turned, wondering if I should just quit this job. But curiosity kept me from giving up. I wanted answers. The next morning, I went back to the basement, determined to approach it on my own terms. I stocked up on fresh batteries, brought a larger flashlight, and even grabbed a small handheld radio that I hoped would work underground. When I reached the basement level, I felt that same heavy air. I breathed deep, turned on my light, and started walking. I told myself I would just finish cataloging the boxes in the main area, gather whatever records I needed, and leave. But I couldn't ignore the side tunnels. They seemed to call me in. And the footsteps started almost right away. Slow, steady, echoing through the damp corridors. I pressed forward, feeling my pulse beat in my ears. I wasn't sure what I would find, but I knew I wasn't alone down there. And I knew that figure was waiting, watching, and hoping I would read something I wasn't supposed to see. I noticed him the moment I settled into my seat. He was outside the train window, matching the train's speed, staring at me like he could see straight through the glass. The car was almost empty, and the lights were dim. The sound of the wheels against the tracks filled the silence. My stomach clenched. No one was supposed to be out there. The train was moving fast, and I couldn't figure out how anyone could keep pace on the other side of the window. I wiped my hands on my jeans. My palms were damp. I leaned closer to the window and tried to see if maybe there was a walkway or a station platform. Nothing. The night sky was deepening into a blur, and the figure kept pace, floating or running. I couldn't tell. He wore clothing that looked old-fashioned. The material seemed heavy, like something from another era. I could see an emblem or medallion on his chest. The shape was unfamiliar. It looked twisted. I don't know how to describe it, but it wasn't a symbol I recognized. My chest felt tight, and my heart thumped. I didn't move for a while. I just stared at him, and he stared back. There was no confusion in his eyes. He looked like he was waiting for me to do something. When the train rattled, I jolted in my seat and glanced at the other passengers. Only 2 people were in this car with me, both up front, and they were dozing, or at least resting with their heads down. Neither one seemed aware of anything unusual. I glanced back at the window. He was still there. The train sped along, yet his figure never shrunk. He remained perfectly aligned with me. His stare made me feel like I was under a bright light, like there was no way to hide.
My shoulders tensed. I felt my throat go dry.
I decided to move. My seat was close to the window, and I didn't want him looking right at me anymore. I grabbed my backpack and walked to another row toward the front of the car. When I sat down, I exhaled hard. I glanced around to see if anyone noticed. The 2 people were still asleep, or half asleep. A faint overhead light flickered, but nobody reacted. I forced myself to look out the window from this new seat. At first I saw nothing except the passing blur of darkness. Then I saw him again. He was outside the new window, staring, still carrying that weird symbol on his chest. My heart pounded. My hands shook. I tried to ignore the jolt in my stomach by pressing my palms against the seat. I felt the warm fabric under my fingers, and it grounded me for a moment. I blinked, hoping maybe my eyes were just tired or playing tricks on me, but he was still there. I saw the same heavy-looking clothes and that same expression. He never blinked. He just kept his eyes on me. I stood up again, my legs unsteady, and moved to the very back of the car. I didn't bother trying to be quiet. I just wanted to get away from that window. As soon as I sat down, I felt a slight vibration in the seat. The train rattled over some track joint, and I heard a dull thud from overhead. Then my eyes drifted to the window again. There he was, outside the window behind me, still staring. It was too much. My stomach turned. I got up and headed for the exit door at the rear of the car, the one that connects to the next car. The metal handle felt cold under my hand. The lights in the connection area hummed. I looked back through the window of the door, and I could see him outside, sliding along the side of the train. The dull station lights whizzed by, but I could still see his outline. I decided I had to get off at the next stop. I didn't care where it was. I just wanted to be off this train, away from that face and that stare. I felt short of breath. My shirt stuck to my back. I moved to the next car, hoping to find more people or even a conductor.
That car was empty.
The seats were all dark blue and looked old. The overhead lights flickered in a slow, annoying pattern. My footsteps echoed against the metal floor. I sank into a seat near the center and tried to steady my breathing. I listened for any sound of footsteps or voices, but everything was quiet. After a minute, I looked out the window again. He was there, right outside, keeping pace. I clenched my jaw. I wanted to see if I could get a better look at him. I pressed my face closer to the glass. He was maybe a foot away from the window. I couldn't see any movement in his limbs. It was like he was gliding. His eyes locked with mine, and I felt a chill crawl up my neck. The symbol on his chest looked like some kind of engraved plate. It had lines and shapes, but none of it made sense to me. I pulled away and decided I should see if I could reach the conductor's cabin. I stood up and walked toward the front of the car, stepping carefully between the rows. My fingers trembled against the seat backs. My legs felt stiff. I slid open the door to the next car and stepped through, ignoring the rush of air from outside. The metal walkway between the cars rattled under my feet. In the next car there were a few more people, maybe 3 or 4. They were spaced out, hunched over in their seats, some with hats pulled low. I tried to gather my courage and approach one. I tapped a tall man in a brown jacket on the shoulder. He turned around looking sleepy. I cleared my throat and asked if he noticed anyone outside the train windows. He frowned and shook his head, then mumbled something about being left alone. He scooted away from me. I tried the next passenger, but she didn't even open her eyes. She just waved a hand at me to leave her alone. My pulse was racing. I felt a prickle of panic. I walked quickly towards the front of the car, looking for a conductor. I found an empty seat near the door. I slumped into it, breathing hard. After a few minutes, the train started to slow. I heard the squeak of brakes and felt the lurch. A station was coming up. I saw lights through the windows. The sign outside was too blurred to read, but I could see a platform with empty benches. My plan was simple: get off, call a rideshare, and go anywhere else. I stood up as soon as the train stopped. My knees were shaky, but I forced myself to the door. The door slid open and a few people left. I moved forward, but as soon as I stepped near the exit, it closed. I pressed the button to open it again. It refused to budge. I tried yanking it. Nothing. The door stayed locked. Then the train started moving. My heart hammered. I pressed my palm against the glass of the door, watching the platform slide away behind us. I watched the outside lights pass by until we were back in darkness. I let out a shaky breath and returned to my seat. My head buzzed with confusion. I didn't understand why the door wouldn't open for me. I was right there. I heard a metallic rattling from outside the window. I glanced to the side and saw him again gliding along the outside. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second and then opened them. He was still there, drifting. I felt my throat tighten. My breathing grew shallow. My arms felt weak. I tried to calm down. I told myself to look for a conductor or someone in uniform. I walked to the front of the car and found a small door labeled crew only. I knocked. No one answered. I knocked again. Harder. Nothing. I tried the handle. It was locked. The overhead speaker crackled, but it was just static. Then it went silent. I felt trapped. The train was still speeding through the night. My phone signal was dead or weak. I checked my screen, but there were no bars. I turned around to see if the figure was outside. He was. The symbol on his chest seemed to glow faintly under the occasional station lights that appeared outside. My spine tingled. I moved back to my seat and sat there with my hands on my knees. I noticed the other passengers. They seemed to ignore me. One person flicked through a newspaper. Another stared at their phone. They paid no attention to the outside. The tension in my shoulders made me feel stiff. My head started to ache. At the next stop, I tried again. I jumped up and rushed to the door. A few people got off. The exit worked for them, but when I tried to follow, the door stayed locked. It didn't even slide open an inch for me. I banged on the glass, but nobody turned around. They just walked away on the platform, and then the train pulled out. I staggered back, feeling a rush of heat in my face. I returned to my seat, breathing fast. My hands shook. Something was keeping me on this train. My stomach churned. The figure outside was always there, wherever I sat. I walked to the last row of seats, near a window that looked out the opposite side from where I usually saw him. He appeared there too. His clothes flapped in the wind. The train's noise was constant. My eyes burned from not blinking enough. I noticed my reflection in the window. I looked pale, my eyes wide. The figure behind the glass had an unchanging expression. He kept holding on to that symbol. Then he lifted it, like he wanted me to focus on it. He brought it closer to the window. I leaned forward. It was a piece of metal with dark lines etched on it. It could have been letters or markings, but I couldn't tell. My brain felt scrambled. I lost track of time. I shifted from car to car, trying not to let the figure out of my sight, but also wishing he would vanish. At one point, I tried to talk to an older man in the second car. He shrugged me off, saying I was acting weird, and told me to sit down. The train's overhead lights flickered even more. I felt a draft from somewhere. Soon I heard the announcement for another stop. The voice on the speaker was garbled, but I caught the name of the station. My heart kicked up again. I stood near the door, determined to try one more time. As we slowed down, I clenched my fists. The second I heard the brakes squeal, I pressed the door button. The door opened just enough for me to see the platform and a bench outside. Then it slid shut. I jammed the button again. Nothing. I stepped back and kicked the door out of frustration. The noise echoed in the empty corner. 1 or 2 passengers glanced at me, but then looked away. My throat felt raw. I paced in front of the door until the train started moving again. My legs felt weak. I couldn't ignore that figure outside anymore. He was still there. My breath shook each time I looked at him. My back felt damp with sweat. I sat down in a random seat. I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes for a second. I wanted to block out the world, but I could still sense him outside. When I opened my eyes, I saw him, and he was staring harder, if that's possible. I whispered to myself, "What do you want?" Then I noticed the symbol again. He pressed it against the window like he was showing it to me. I squinted. The lines on the metal looked like they formed shapes or letters. Maybe they meant something. I felt a strange compulsion to place my hand against the glass. My arm moved on its own. Or at least it felt that way. My fingertips touched the cold surface. He did the same from his side, but I felt no contact except for the cold glass. I stayed like that for a few seconds. My heart rate slowed a bit, though I was still scared. Then, as if satisfied, he pulled back. I watched him slip away from the window. A gust of wind shook the train, and I lost sight of him for a moment. My stomach clenched again. I stood up, hoping maybe he'd gone. I stepped into the aisle, clutching the seat backs for balance. Then I saw him at the next window over. He was moving along the outside, heading toward the next car. I followed him through the aisle. A part of me wanted to stop and remain seated, but my feet carried me forward. I felt a numb tingle in my legs. I entered the gap between cars. The wind in that small passage was loud. My ears popped. I looked through the door's window into the next car. He was outside, paused at the window waiting for me to enter. I slid the door open and stepped in. This car was empty. Seats were all vacant. The lights were dimmer than ever. I heard a faint buzzing overhead. I walked halfway down the aisle and I heard a metallic screech from outside. It sounded like something dragging along the side of the train. I looked out. He was pressing that symbol against the metal frame. Sparks flickered. I jumped back, alarmed. Then I noticed he was staring at me while he did it. He seemed to be carving something into the train's exterior. I gritted my teeth. My hands shook at my sides. I couldn't figure out what he was doing or how I could make him stop. I pressed my forehead to the window. I saw that he had carved lines into the train wall. They looked similar to the markings on that symbol. He lifted his head to meet my eyes. I felt a new wave of cold. The train lurched again, and I lost my balance for a moment. I grabbed the seat to steady myself. When I looked back out, I saw him move on, continuing toward the next window. I followed him. My footfalls sounded heavy, and my throat felt dry. I kept telling myself to do something, to break a window or pull an emergency brake, but my body felt sluggish. My mind was scattered. I just followed him as he guided me through each car. Whenever the train stopped at another station, I tried to break free, but the doors never opened for me, even if they opened for other passengers. It was the same sequence every time the train would stop. The doors would open for a second, and I'd rush forward. Then they'd clamp shut. I'd mash the button, pull the lever, try the manual release. Nothing worked. Then the train would move again. Eventually I found myself in the front car. There were a few seats in the door that presumably led to the operator's cabin. It was locked when I tried it. I looked out the front window. The tracks stretched into the darkness. I heard the steady hum of the engine. No sign of the figure in the front window. Then I turned and glanced at the side windows. There he was. He hovered outside, close to the door that led to the operator's cabin from the outside walkway. He raised his hand, pressing that symbol to the window once more. I watched him carefully. A part of me wanted to shout or scream for help, but there was no one around to help. My voice felt stuck in my throat. He lowered the symbol, and for the first time I saw his lips move like he might be speaking. I heard nothing from inside the train, just the sound of wheels on the hum of lights. But I could see the shape of his mouth forming words. I couldn't read his lips, but I sensed he was telling me to stay put. I felt my breathing slow. My heart still pounded, but there was a weird calm in my chest. I realized I might not have a choice. The train kept moving. The stations went by in a blur. The few passengers left eventually got off, leaving me alone in the front car. The overhead announcement stopped working after a while. The cabin door remained locked. My phone still had no signal. I sat near the window and stared out at him. He stared back.
His face was hard to read. No anger, no fear, no sadness.
I focused on his eyes, trying to see if there was any hint of what he wanted. My stomach twisted with uncertainty, but I stayed there. I felt a slight vibration from the tracks. The seat trembled under me. The rest of the ride passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Each time the train slowed, I got up, hoping for a chance to jump off or push past the doors. Each time the doors refused to open, each time I saw him outside, making sure I didn't leave. My body felt sore from all the jolts and from holding myself so tense. My throat burned from shallow breathing. Hours seemed to pass. I stared out at the dark landscape. I heard the mechanical sigh of the train. I noticed a shift in the lights as if the train's power flickered. Then I felt the train start to slow again. This time there was no station that I could see. We just rolled into a dark stretch of track. The train came to a full stop. I stood up and looked out the front window. Nothing but darkness. I looked out the side window. The figure was still there, close to me. I tried the door. It stayed locked. I reached for the emergency exit handle. It didn't move. My arms trembled. I looked back at him and saw his hand on the outside handle, like he was holding it shut from his side. The lights flickered again, and I heard the hum of the engine fade. The interior lights stayed on, but they glowed weak. The air felt stale. I pressed my ear to the door leading to the operator's cabin. There was no sound. I knocked and there was no response. I noticed my reflection in the window again. I looked drained. I turned back to the figure. He hovered outside, waiting. I gripped the seat next to me. My legs felt weak. I forced myself to take slow breaths. I asked him in a shaky voice, "Why are you here?" I didn't expect an answer. I got none, but he didn't leave. He pressed the symbol against the glass one more time. I leaned forward, staring at it. The lines almost looked like a map or instructions. My head pounded. I closed my eyes for a moment, then opened them again. He hadn't moved. The train was silent around me, except for the faint buzz of the lights. The brakes hissed, and everything went still. I realized I was stuck, and somehow he wanted me to accept that. I stayed in my seat, unsure what else to do, feeling every muscle in my body tense. That's where I am right now, sitting here with him outside the window. I can see him clearly under the weak light. He hasn't vanished or changed. He's waiting, and I'm not going anywhere. I don't have a clue when the train will move again, or when these doors will let me out. I just know I can't leave until whatever is happening here is done, and I know he won't leave me alone until I figure it out.
I don't know how long I can keep my composure.
But I have no choice. This train and that figure outside are all that exist for me right now, and until it's over, I'm stuck here, staring back. I never expected to feel uneasy in a place that people call holy. I thought old churches were supposed to feel calm, but the moment I set foot in that confession booth, my stomach clenched. I heard a strange noise inside. It sounded like someone exhaling slow and shaky. I stepped back and stared at the narrow doorway. A dull glow from the overhead chandelier spilled across the worn wooden surface. The booth looked abandoned. Nobody had used it in years, according to what the caretaker told me. Yet I was sure I wasn't alone in there. I volunteer at this century-old church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. My main job is organizing the old archives stored in boxes near the back hallway. They keep letters, old council notes, sacramental records, and other papers in dusty cabinets. Most of these documents are delicate. I move them carefully and sort them by date. I keep a log of everything. The church staff mostly leaves me alone, which suits me fine. I don't like a crowd hovering over my shoulder. Plus, the basement office has a steady temperature, so I focus better without the heat or cold distracting me. On this particular evening I stayed later than usual because I lost track of time. One of the older parishioners told me there might be some missing files in a storage closet near the confessional booth. I decided to go check. The main hallway was quiet, and my footsteps echoed against the tall ceiling. The overhead lamps flickered a bit, giving the corridor an uneven glow. The caretaker had said he'd lock up at 9, but he usually waited until I was done. Kat's a polite guy. He never rushes me, so I took my time. The old confession booth stands in the left corner of the main chapel. It has a small wooden door and a faded curtain. I remember stepping over a loose tile in the floor near the entrance. The caretaker once told me that the priest who used to listen to confessions in that booth died a long time ago. After that, they put up a newer booth on the opposite side of the chapel, closer to the altar. This old one stayed unused. Some people said it was falling apart. Others said it had a strange smell. I never noticed anything before that night. I approached the booth and reached for the handle. That's when I heard a muffled sound inside. It was a soft whimper like someone sighing into their hands. I froze and leaned in, pressing my ear closer to the door. My heart thudded against my chest. The booth was dark, and I couldn't see any movement through the worn curtain. I whispered, "Hello?" I waited. No answer. I heard one more faint sigh, but it might have been my imagination. I tried to swallow my nerves and slowly pulled the door open. The interior had a small wooden bench on each side, separated by a thin partition. The partition had a metal grid with small holes. That's where the priest and the person confessing would speak. The wood smelled like mold and old varnish. I ran my hand over the bench and my fingertips came away dusty. There was no one inside. I scanned the corners, but it was cramped and there wasn't room for anyone to hide. I felt a little foolish for getting so worked up. Still, I stood there for a moment, trying to shake off the weird feeling. Then I noticed a folded piece of paper stuck behind the metal grid. I gently pried it free. It tore a bit, because it was fragile. The paper felt brittle. When I opened it, I saw handwritten words in faded ink. They were in some kind of cursive, but I could make out a few sentences. Most of them said things like, "I carry this weight, and I cannot speak of it out loud." It made me uneasy. I glanced at the date on the corner of the paper. It was from decades ago. The writer mentioned feeling trapped by the church's silence, but they never detailed what that silence was about. I took the paper, folded it back up, and decided to bring it to the caretaker. Before leaving, I thought I heard a small sound from the other side of the partition. Quiet, like someone shifting their knees on a cushion. But there was no one there when I looked. I decided I needed some fresh air. My chest felt tight. I locked the door to the booth as best I could, and hurried back to the main entrance. The caretaker was standing by the large wooden doors waiting for me. He asked if everything was all right, and I just nodded. I didn't mention the weird sound because I didn't want to look like I was spooked by an empty booth. That night I dreamed about the confessional. I saw the metal grid in front of me, and I heard faint sobbing on the other side. I woke up in a sweat around 3 in the morning. My heart pounded and my throat felt dry. I got up for a glass of water and tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but something told me to go back there the next day. I wanted to find more papers or maybe get an answer about what was going on. I tried to push the thought away, but it stuck with me all morning. The next afternoon I arrived at the church earlier than usual. I said hello to the receptionist, then walked straight toward the old booth. I noticed something strange right away. The door was slightly ajar, even though I remembered pulling it closed the night before. The caretaker might have checked on it, so I tried not to overthink it. Still, I felt a jolt in my stomach as I moved closer. The corridor smelled musty, like wet stone. The old wooden pews creaked when I brushed against them. I stepped inside the booth again. The dust on the bench looked disturbed, like someone had sat there recently. I felt goosebumps on my arms. I ran my hand over the surface and saw a clear impression of a palm print. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to say something, but my mouth felt dry. I stood still for a moment, listening. I caught a faint noise behind the grid. It was a soft, shaky exhale, like a person trying to speak but holding back. I leaned forward, pressing my ear near the metal holes. My heart thumped so hard I felt it in my ears. I said quietly, "Is someone there?" I waited. No response. I noticed another folded paper tucked under the edge of the bench. I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was the same. This time the words mentioned guilt, the church's involvement in hiding something, and how they never admitted their fault. The writer said they wanted absolution, but no priest would offer it without them speaking the full truth. The note ended abruptly, as if the person couldn't finish writing. There was no signature. I left the booth feeling tense. My hands trembled. I shut the door and it made a soft creaking sound. I took the paper to the caretaker, but he said he hadn't opened that booth in years. He insisted nobody else would have gone in there. He gave me a curious look and asked if I was sure about what I found. I showed him the paper. He shrugged and said he would ask the priest if he knew anything about old confessions tucked away. I didn't tell him about the noise I kept hearing. I didn't want to sound ridiculous. Over the next week I felt drawn to that booth. Every time I walked by, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. One evening I decided to stay alone after hours to see if I could figure out what was happening. The caretaker locked up, but left me the key. I told him I'd locked the door on my way out. He didn't ask questions. The chapel was quiet. I had my phone's flashlight and I walked slowly around the edges of the pews, listening for anything out of place. When I finally approached the booth, I noticed the faint smell of old incense. The door was closed. My pulse sped up. I opened the door carefully, stepped inside and shut it behind me. I let my eyes adjust to the dark. I sat on the bench and waited. The wood creaked under my weight. My hands felt sweaty. I stared at the metal grid, half expecting to see a face. But there was nothing visible, just darkness on the other side. Still, I heard a slight shuffle, like cloth dragging along the floor. I spoke in a calm voice. "I don't know who you are, but I'm here to listen." My heart pounded. For a moment, I thought I heard a whisper. I leaned forward. My body tensed, and I felt a chill run across my neck. I opened my mouth again, but no sound came out. Then I heard a faint exhale, so soft that I questioned my own ears. I repeated, "I'm here. I can help." My chest felt tight, and I breathed shallowly. A few moments later, something slid under the partition. It was another sheet of yellowed paper folded in half. My hand shook as I picked it up. I aimed my phone's flashlight at it. The text mentioned betrayal, conspiracies, and a request for forgiveness. The writer claimed that the church had hidden evidence of wrongdoing that affected many people. The note was full of anger and regret. The writer blamed themselves for keeping quiet. It ended with the phrase, "I seek absolution, but no one will grant it." My hands felt cold. I clutched the paper, my mind racing. I spoke out loud. "I don't know what happened. I'm not a priest. I can't absolve anything." My voice cracked. A heavy silence settled. I stood up, bracing myself against the booth's wall. My knees felt weak. I opened the door and stepped out, my heart pounding so hard that my chest hurt. I scanned the chapel. It was empty. The overhead lights were dim. I took a deep breath and forced my feet to move. I locked the booth behind me. For the next few days, I tried to focus on my volunteer work. I spent hours in the archive room sorting documents, but I couldn't stop thinking about the notes and the strange presence. I started having trouble sleeping. Each night, I dreamed of the metal grid and a muffled voice calling my name. My body would jerk awake, drenched in sweat. My appetite got worse, and I skipped a few meals. My co-workers at the church noticed I looked tired, but I said I was fine. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I gathered all the notes I had found, spread them out on a table in the basement office, and compared the handwriting. They all matched. I tried to figure out the timeline. From the scattered dates I saw on the corners of some pages, they ranged from about 50 years ago to maybe 30 years ago. The language repeated certain phrases, hidden truth, that the church refuses to acknowledge. I cannot say more. It all suggested the writer was trying to confess to something involving a cover-up, but they never said exactly what happened. I thought about bringing these notes to one of the current priests, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure how they would react. I also felt like I was prying into something that wasn't my business, but the presence in that booth had singled me out, or at least that's how I felt. The caretaker shrugged whenever I mentioned strange sounds. He said old buildings make noises. They might expand due to wood settling, or the wind blow through cracks in the structure. I tried to believe that, but the folded papers were real and they kept appearing. One late afternoon, I decided to go back and wait in the booth one more time. The church was nearly empty. I heard a choir practice somewhere down the hall, but it sounded distant. I walked straight to the old booth and slid inside. I left the door open a crack so I wouldn't feel trapped. I placed a small flashlight on my lap. The bench felt colder than before, and I tried to steady my breathing. After a few minutes, I heard the soft shuffle again. My muscles tensed, and I clenched my jaw. I whispered, "I'm listening. I have the papers. I've seen what you wrote." My voice felt shaky. I leaned toward the grid. The wooden partition was dark. My phone vibrated in my pocket, and I almost jumped. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't want to break the moment. The shuffle got louder, and I sensed movement on the other side. I couldn't see any shape, just darkness. My heart raced. Sweat trickled down my temple. My fingers tingled. A quiet exhale came through the grid. It sounded desperate, like a person who wanted to speak but couldn't form words. I whispered again, "You need to tell me what happened." My own pulse throbbed in my ears. I felt my stomach twist. I half expected an actual voice to answer, but it never came. Instead, another piece of paper slid onto my side. This one was thicker, with more text. It said, "I cannot face judgment from those who remain silent about their own guilt. I came to speak the truth, but the church ignored me. They told me to stay quiet." I read the note twice, my hands shaking so badly that the paper rattled. My breathing felt shallow. I could almost imagine the person on the other side hunched over, head bowed, struggling to get the words out. I looked through the grid but saw nothing. Then I heard footsteps in the hall and a choir member passed by. The sound of their footsteps echoed, and I realized it was dark outside. I felt exposed. The wave of nausea hit me, and I stood up, stuffing the note in my pocket. I said quietly, "I can't help you. I don't know what to do." I waited for a response, but there was only silence. I backed out of the booth, closed the door, and walked away. My arms felt weak, and my head spun. I made it to the side entrance and fumbled with the keys. Once outside, I gasped for air. The evening breeze chilled the sweat on my forehead. I stood there, heart pounding, trying to understand what I had just experienced. I felt like someone wanted me to grant them forgiveness for something the church had done or hidden. I was just a volunteer. I had no power to do anything. I haven't gone back to that booth in the last 2 days. I'm avoiding it. I keep thinking about those notes. They mention a secret that the church never revealed. They suggest an ongoing guilt that weighs on whoever wrote them. I don't know if it's a spirit or my imagination, but I heard those sighs. I found those papers. I can't ignore that. I'm starting to believe there might be some leftover pain trapped in that booth. I don't have proof, but I can't forget that muffled voice either. All I know is that something is still there, waiting to confess. It seems to want absolution for a sin that was never acknowledged by anyone else. I can't decide if I should keep searching or just walk away. Right now, I feel caught in the middle of this old building's secrets. My hands shake when I think about it, and I can't help looking over my shoulder whenever I pass by the confessional doors. Something in that ancient wood is calling to me, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to keep listening. But I also know I might not be able to stop. I woke up 3 days ago with a jolt, and my heart was pounding. My home office door made a strange noise in the middle of the night. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but the next morning, I found scratches around the door handle. It looked like someone had tried to get inside while I was asleep. That was my first real sign that something wasn't right in my house. I'm a 39-year-old man, and I live alone. I moved into this place around 6 months ago because I needed a dedicated space for my research projects. I do archival work and sometimes study old documents for private clients. I didn't think this house had anything unusual about it when I chose it. The rent was affordable, and the layout suited my needs. There's a small room upstairs that I turned into my office. I had a desk, a decent computer, some filing cabinets, and shelves with books. Everything looks simple. I don't have fancy furniture or decorations. I like things neat and organized. During the first few weeks, nothing bothered me. I spent my days going through tons of digital archives and physical copies, checking references for people who pay me to find obscure pieces of information. Sometimes I work into the night, but usually I make sure to get at least 6 hours of sleep. My schedule might change when I'm overwhelmed with tasks, but I try to keep to a routine. That routine got interrupted by the strange events that started about a month ago. The scratches on the door weren't the only clue. One morning, I walked into my office and noticed my papers spread out on the floor. It looked like someone had flipped through them. Some documents were missing, and I found them later in the living room. I remember picking them up near the couch. I didn't recall taking them downstairs. My first thought was that I was tired and might have brought them down without noticing. But the more I tried to remember, the more it seemed impossible. I don't leave my office in disarray. I'm careful. I rely on a system so I don't lose track of important files. The day after that, I found a book open on my desk, turned to a section I hadn't looked at in years. It was a reference book related to some obscure research methods. I had used it once, but never revisited it. Seeing it open at a page about forbidden studies made me uneasy. The words on the page focused on old medical procedures that the authorities had banned. I didn't see any immediate relevance to my own projects, so I closed the book and put it back on the shelf. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somebody wanted me to see that page. I started locking the office door. I turned the lock at night and checked it twice. Still, the next morning I'd find the door slightly ajar. It was only open an inch or so, but it was definitely not how I left it. My books would be rearranged on the shelves. Some documents vanished and reappeared in other corners of the house. At first, my initial reaction was to suspect a break-in, but I found no evidence of forced entry other than the scratches. Nothing was missing in the rest of the house. My wallet stayed in the same place on the kitchen counter, and my TV was untouched. I called a locksmith to change the locks on the office door. I thought maybe the old lock was faulty. After the locksmith replaced everything, I felt more secure. But that same night, I heard a thump in the hallway around 2 o'clock. I slid out of bed and felt my legs shaking slightly. My mouth went dry, and I gripped a flashlight that I keep next to the bed. When I opened the bedroom door, the hallway was dimly lit, with only a small nightlight providing light. I saw something near the office door, a shape, a silhouette of a person. I couldn't see details, only a dark outline. I froze for a second. My breathing got shallow, and I felt sweat forming on my forehead. I tried to move quietly, but the floor creaked. The silhouette turned its head. I heard a faint mumbling sound that sounded like words, but they weren't clear. I raised the flashlight and said, "Who's there?" There was no response. The figure just stood there. My heart pounded against my chest, and I thought about running back into my bedroom to call the police. But something kept me in place. I inched forward step by step. Then the figure drifted backward, almost gliding away. When it passed my nightlight, I got a glimpse of a face, but it was faint, almost transparent. It disappeared around the corner. I raced down the hall, but there was nothing there. I checked the front door, still locked. All the windows were secured. I felt a chill on my arms and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I went to the office door. It was locked from the outside, just as I had left it, but there were new smudges around the handle like greasy fingerprints. My keys were in my pocket. I had no idea how anyone could have tampered with the door. I returned to my bedroom, switching on every light I could find along the way, and tried to calm myself down. The next morning I found my desk in disarray again. Some pages about old experiments were scattered around. They mentioned unusual procedures that defied standard ethics. I don't usually keep stuff like that in my files. I do basic research, mostly genealogical or historical, nothing that strays into forbidden territory. I spent most of the day double-checking my references, trying to figure out why these documents were here. They belonged to an old folder I had saved from a previous occupant's leftover materials. When I first moved in, I found a box of his documents in the attic. It was mostly random data about medical trials and unapproved techniques. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured it was worthless, so I tucked it away in one of my file cabinets. I opened that old box again. I realized there were notes about attempts to conduct secret experiments. Most of it looked incomplete, like half-formed ideas for some strange research. I didn't recognize the name of the person who wrote them. There was a signature that looked like Dr. S. Keller or something similar, but some letters were faded. The more I read, the more I understood that this previous resident had been deep into unethical experiments. I saw references to prolonged consciousness and post-life continuity. Everything was vague and disorganized, but it made me feel uneasy. I decided to throw it all out, but a part of me wanted to see if it connected to what had been happening in my office. I set the documents aside for now. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the image of that silhouette near my office door. I kept hearing that quiet mumbling. I left my bedroom door open because I wanted to see if anything would move in the hallway. Around 3 a.m. I heard a faint whisper. Archives must finish. My heart beat hard. I threw off my blanket and grabbed the flashlight. My bare feet felt cold against the floor as I stepped into the hallway. The silhouette stood there again, closer to my bedroom this time. It looked like a man. He had a faint outline of a coat. I didn't see his eyes, only a suggestion of a face. He turned toward the office door and ran his hand along the wood. That's when I heard scratching, like fingernails scraping the surface. I wanted to yell at him to leave, but my voice came out weak. He shifted his attention to me and his mouth moved, but I only heard garbled speech. I managed to say, "Get out of my house." He seemed to tilt his head, almost confused. Then he repeated, "Archives, old records." I took a step forward, and he backed away, disappearing down the stairs this time. I hurried after him, but by the time I reached the staircase, there was no one. I checked the living room, the kitchen, every door, every lock, all secure. My body felt tense. My throat was dry, and I noticed I was trembling. I tried to calm myself with a glass of water. Eventually, I sat in the living room until sunrise, unsure how to handle this. I was sure by now that I was dealing with something not entirely normal. When daylight came, I returned to the box of old documents and read everything more carefully. I found a page that mentioned the activation of old facilities and location-based attachments. It also mentioned the phrase continuation beyond the living. I started thinking that maybe the person who wrote these notes had died before completing his experiments. Perhaps he left behind some kind of imprint. I didn't know how else to explain the figure I was seeing. I still wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts, but it was the only explanation that fit the weird behavior in my office. Books moving, documents appearing in random places, as if someone were trying to work on those old notes. I realized I had to get answers, so I checked the local records office for previous owners of my house. I discovered that a man named Samuel Keller lived there about 20 years ago. He was a researcher at some private facility that got shut down for unethical practices. The articles I found mentioned that he vanished under suspicious circumstances, but there was no record of his death. Some rumors claimed he fled the country or changed his identity. Others said he died in the house. The official reports were inconclusive, so I couldn't confirm anything. That evening, I decided to stay awake by my office door. I locked it as usual, turned off the lights, and sat on a small stool in the hallway. Around 1:30 a.m., the door started rattling. I heard the sound of the handle clicking. My chest tightened and I felt a rush of adrenaline. I switched on my flashlight and saw the silhouette crouched in front of the door, trying to push it open. He turned toward me, then stood up. I saw him more clearly. He had hollow cheeks and a long face, dark eyes, and old-fashioned clothes, maybe from a few decades ago. His eyes seemed to mouth the words, "I need the files." I could barely make out the sentence, but it seemed direct. I didn't smell anything unusual, but I felt a cold breeze. I stood there and said, "Stop messing with my work." My voice shook a bit. He remained still for a second. Then he reached through the door as if his hand could pass through solid material. I heard the lock click, and the door swung open on its own. My breath caught in my throat. I got up, shining the flashlight inside the office. Papers were flying off the shelves, landing on the floor. The silhouette stepped into the office, flipping through the pages. Then he spun around toward me and shouted something. The sound wasn't loud, but it felt like a heavy pressure on my ears. I couldn't understand the exact words, but I knew he was furious. My flashlight flickered, and I felt my legs tense up. Part of me wanted to rush in and grab him, but I couldn't move. My body locked up. Then everything went quiet. The figure looked at the documents spread on the floor and took a few steps, as if examining them. He kept saying short phrases, final steps, incomplete, must finish. My heart pounded, and I tried to breathe slowly. I didn't want him to sense my fear. I forced myself to speak. "What do you want?" I asked. He turned my way, but his expression was blank. Suddenly, he rushed past me and disappeared into the hallway. The door slammed behind him, and I heard footsteps going down the stairs. When I followed, he was gone. After that night, I decided I needed to do something with the old research materials. I spread them all over my desk and tried to figure out what was so important. I found more references to unauthorized experiments, typed in handwritten notes about continuing trials at any cost, and instructions about using specific instruments. There were mentions of underground labs, but no addresses. I felt a surge of anxiety. The more I looked at those files, the more I sensed that this was the core of what that figure wanted. He was stuck trying to finish whatever he had started. I gathered the notes into a big pile. My first instinct was to burn them, but I worried that might trigger something else or make the situation worse. So I stacked them carefully in a box and placed it inside my closet. The next few nights were calmer. I still heard the occasional shuffle outside the office door, but I didn't see the silhouette. The door remained locked in the morning. My books stayed where I left them, but my relief didn't last long. A week later, I was woken up again by that same voice. It was around 2 a.m. I heard, "Bring me the files." That phrase repeated twice. I sat on the edge of my bed, feeling my shoulders tense up. I opened my closet and pulled out the box of documents. I carried them downstairs to the living room. I set them on the coffee table and stood loud. "Here are the files you want," I said. My hands felt clammy, and my stomach was tight. The room went cold. A door down the hall creaked. I saw a slight shimmer by the wall, like something moving in the corner of my vision. I placed my hand on top of the box and said, "Take them." The next thing I knew, the papers inside shifted around, almost as if a gust of wind hit them. They scattered across the coffee table, but none fell to the floor. I watched my heart drumming in my ears. Slowly, the pages settled back into the box. The air felt normal again. I turned around, and the silhouette was there, standing by the window. He raised his hand as if acknowledging me. Then he faded away. I stared at the window for a few seconds, not sure if I should feel relieved or terrified. I decided to gather the box and lock it in the trunk of my car outside. I didn't want those papers in my house anymore. My plan was to drive them to a storage facility the next day and leave them there. Maybe that would appease whatever was haunting my office. If that figure wanted the files, maybe I just needed to remove them from my home so the energy or whatever presence it had would move on. That's where things stand now. It's been a few days and I haven't seen the silhouette again. My office door no longer has fresh scratches. I don't see random books moved out of place. My documents stay where I put them. Although I still feel uneasy at night, I haven't fully relaxed. I check the hallway at random times, expecting to see that shape again. So far, there's only silence. Maybe he's satisfied with where the files ended up, or maybe he's still searching for something else.
I don't have the answers.
All I know is that the tension in my chest has lessened, and I'm able to work without interruption. But I can't shake the memory of that silhouette standing there mumbling about old archives and incomplete work. I plan to move out once my lease is up. I don't think I can stay here long term. Even if the activity has settled, I don't like the idea of sharing space with the memory of those experiments. I still don't know if that man, Dr. Keller, died here or disappeared somewhere else. I only know that his presence lingered enough to make my life miserable for weeks. Maybe I'll never see him again, but at least for now I can sleep through the night without hearing that voice by my door scratching to get in. And that's all I want, to feel like I'm alone in my own house again. I still remember how it felt when I first saw that phonograph. I was at a local auction house just looking around for something interesting. The moment I spotted the old machine, I felt a strange rush. It had a dark wooden base and a large horn with a faded brass finish. The design looked handcrafted, full of little details around the edges. I had no plan to spend much money that day, but something about that piece drew me in. I raised my paddle and offered my bid. Nobody else seemed interested, so I got it without much competition. By the time I walked out, I felt oddly satisfied, like I'd found something I wasn't supposed to own. When I brought it home, I set it on a table in my living room. I was proud of how it looked, but it had a worn-out feel. The metal horn had a few dents. The wood had scratches. Still, The overall shape was intact. It wasn't just some cheap antique. It looked valuable, and I was happy to add it to my collection. I ran my hand along the edges of the wooden casing. The finish felt rough, as if it had been stored in a damp place for years. That evening, I wiped off the dust with a soft cloth. I checked the inside of the horn, which had a bit of grime caked on. I used a small brush to clear it out. When I was done, I tested the main crank. It didn't move. It felt stuck, like the internal mechanism was jammed. I figured I would have to open it up and see if the gears needed oil or replacement. I left it alone for a few days, thinking I'd work on it when I had more time. Nothing unusual happened at first. It just sat there, an old phonograph that didn't run. But one night, while I was reading in my armchair, I heard a faint vibration. I looked around but couldn't pinpoint the source right away. Then the tone got a bit louder. It was coming from the phonograph. At first I thought something inside it was rattling because of a draft or maybe an air current from the heating system. But then I noticed the sound rising and forming a low hum. The horn seemed to channel the hum, like something was trying to push through it. I stood up and approached the phonograph. My heart felt a little jumpy. The hum kept going, but I didn't see anything moving. The crank was still stuck. There was no record on the turntable. Yet, I heard this dull, continuous sound. Then it stopped. The silence that followed felt almost heavier than the hum. I waited a few seconds, then tapped the top of the wooden case. There was no response. I shrugged it off. I figured maybe something inside was adjusting to the temperature in my house. The next day I fiddled with the crank again. Still stuck. I tried pulling the turntable off to check the gears. It wouldn't budge. I decided not to force it. I didn't want to break any components. I told myself I'd call someone who knew about antique phonographs. Meanwhile, I kept it as a decorative piece. I had no reason to think it would do anything else strange. A few nights later, around midnight, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water. I heard a light melody drift in from the living room. I froze, water bottle in hand. The melody wasn't something I recognized. It had a jittery, off-tempo sound, reminding me of old experimental music. But I had no stereo on, and my TV was off. I placed the bottle on the counter and walked toward the sound. When I reached the living room, I saw the phonograph's turntable spinning slowly and unevenly, but definitely moving. I saw no record. The needle arm was lowered, as if it were tracing an invisible record. The horn projected a faint tune. I stood there, unsure what to do. My chest felt tight, my fingertips cold. I whispered, "What the hell?" to nobody in particular. I leaned closer. The melody had these odd, high-pitched vocals that didn't sound like English or any other language I recognized. The voices rose and fell in a pattern that made me feel uneasy. My skin prickled. I looked for a power cord, but this thing was purely mechanical, with no visible electrical modification. Suddenly the turntable stopped. The horn fell silent, and the needle arm clicked back up on its own. I stepped back. My heart was pounding in my ears. I spent the rest of that night pacing around my living room, thinking there must be some rational explanation. Maybe someone had retrofitted it with a hidden device. I imagined a small speaker inside, but when I cleaned it, there wasn't any sign of that, and that crank was stuck solid. I eventually went to bed, but I slept poorly. Every creak in the house made me flinch. Over the next week, the phonograph stayed quiet during the day. Every time I walked by it, I'd pause and stare at the horn, waiting for any movement or sound. Nothing happened. But on the fourth night, right around midnight, it came alive again. This time I was in the living room, determined to see it firsthand. At exactly 12 a.m., the needle arm lowered onto an empty turntable. The horn emitted a short burst of static. Then the melody started. It was scratchy and warped. I leaned in and listened. The vocals were more distinct. There were multiple voices weaving in and out like some sort of discordant chorus. They pronounced words I didn't understand. My stomach felt queasy. The air in the room felt colder. I felt little tremors in my arms, as if a slight shake I couldn't control. After a few minutes, it went silent again. I glanced at the clock. It was 12. The entire event lasted about 5 minutes. Then it just shut off on its own. I ran my hand over the machine. The wood felt cool, as if it had been out in the night air. I tried to see if the turntable was still spinning, but it was still. I jiggled the crank, stuck as always. I took a deep breath and walked to my bedroom. I tried to read a book to calm my nerves, but my mind kept drifting to those strange voices. The next morning, I decided I needed to learn more about where this phonograph came from. I contacted the auction house. The clerk said they didn't have a detailed record of its origin, just that it was part of an estate sale. She gave me the name of the estate, a large property that once belonged to composer Adrian Vogel. I took that name and searched online. I found a few old articles about a man with that name. He had been a composer in the early 1900s, known for unusual sound experiments. The article mentioned he tried to record otherworldly frequencies. It sounded ridiculous, but it lined up with what was happening. I eventually tracked down a private collector who had some documents about Vogel. We met at a small coffee shop. He was an older guy who wore thick glasses and carried a worn briefcase. He pulled out a few newspaper clippings and some handwritten notes. According to what he'd gathered, Vogel believed that certain combinations of frequencies could open pathways to other planes of existence. He also made phonograph prototypes designed to capture sounds that couldn't be detected by normal devices. People thought he was crazy. He vanished from the public eye after his experiments failed to gain acceptance. Apparently, some of his prototypes disappeared over time. One might have been sold in that estate sale. When I told the collector about my phonograph's strange behavior, he stared at me in silence for a moment. Then he said, "Some folks claim Vogel's machines can still tap into signals we don't understand. I wouldn't keep it in my house if I were you." His voice was calm, but his eyes looked worried. I thanked him for his time and went home feeling more uneasy than ever. That night I sat in my living room waiting for midnight. I placed a digital recorder on a table near the phonograph. I wanted to capture the sound. As the clock neared 12 o'clock, I felt my heart rate increase. I couldn't sit still. I paced back and forth, checking the clock every few seconds. At exactly midnight, the turntable started rotating again, slowly, with that soft squeak of old metal. The recorder picked up static. Then the strange music began. The voices sounded closer and more layered than before. I heard a low hum beneath them like a faint drone. My hair stood on end. My hands were sweaty. I gripped the edge of a chair to steady myself. I forced myself to keep watching. The horn vibrated with every note. The music rose, then fell. The voices sounded like they were pleading or chanting. My stomach churned. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I should turn on all the lights, but I couldn't move. After about 4 or 5 minutes, it stopped. The recorder showed the audio levels had spiked. I played it back, but the playback was a mess of static and distortion. I could hardly make out the music I just heard. I slammed the recorder down on the table, feeling frustrated and scared. It was like the phonograph wouldn't let itself be recorded properly. I spent the next day torn between wanting to get rid of the phonograph and wanting to solve the mystery. I stood in front of it with a flashlight, examining every inch. I checked for hidden wires, compartments, anything that could explain this. There was nothing, just old wood, metal gears, and a needle arm. The entire thing felt ordinary, except for the fact that it played music by itself. My mind drifted to the possibility that Vogel's experiments had worked. But that idea made me anxious. I tried to focus on practical solutions. Could it be an elaborate prank? Could someone have installed some advanced mechanism inside it? Every midnight, the phonograph repeated its act. Each time, the music grew a bit clearer. The voices sounded more pronounced, though I still couldn't understand a word. The effect on me was strong. My palms would sweat. My mouth would go dry. Sometimes I'd feel a pressure on my chest, like the air in the room got heavier. After it ended, I'd sit on my couch wide awake for hours trying to figure out what I just heard. I started sleeping with the lights on in my bedroom. I didn't like admitting that I was scared, but my body's reactions were strong. My shoulders were stiff all the time. My appetite faded. I felt on edge at work, glancing at the clock, counting the hours until midnight. After 2 weeks of this routine, I decided I had to take more serious steps. I found an old repair shop that dealt with vintage audio equipment. I explained to the owner, a middle-aged man named Ron, that my phonograph had some unusual issues and asked if he could take a look. I didn't tell him the whole story. I just said it would run without being wound up and made strange sounds. He agreed to examine it. I loaded the phonograph into my truck and drove to his shop. He had a back room full of dusty radios, record players, and spare parts. We set it on a workbench, and he used a flashlight and a couple of screwdrivers to open the base. I stood nearby, watching his every move. He checked the gears, the spring mechanism, and the needle arm assembly. He looked puzzled. "This thing doesn't have a functional spring," he said. "It's rusted and stuck. There's no way it should spin," he added. I asked him to confirm. He tapped on the metal parts with a small tool. "Yeah, it's seized up," he said. "You'd need a full replacement." His brow furrowed. He checked the horn for any modern electronics. Found nothing. He powered on a small light to inspect further. Then he shrugged. "I've never seen anything like this," he said. "Mechanically, it's a wreck. It shouldn't play at all." I paid him for his time. He suggested I keep it as a display piece, because it would cost a lot to restore. I didn't tell him about the midnight performances. I didn't think he believed me. I drove home, carrying a sense of dread. Now I knew for sure that the phonograph was impossible from a normal standpoint. When I got back, I placed it in the living room again. I considered leaving it in my garage, but a part of me wanted to keep observing it. I wanted answers even though I was nervous. That night I stayed up again, watching the clock. At midnight the phonograph kicked into motion. The voices were more pronounced than ever. I could hear slight pauses like they were forming sentences. A chill shot through my body. My arm shook. My chest felt tight. The chanting rose for a moment, then dropped into low tones. The hair on my neck stood up. I thought I saw a flicker of movement near the horn, but I wasn't sure if it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I moved closer, but my legs felt heavy. My mind told me to step back. When it ended, I realized my clothes were damp with sweat. I smelled this faint odor in the air, like a musty basement or wet stone. I double-checked my windows, making sure they were all closed. They were. That smell was coming from the phonograph. My heart thumped as I leaned in to see if anything was there. Just the horn. Silent again. I took a few steps back. My mind raced. I needed to decide whether to keep it or get rid of it. The next day, I looked for a place that might buy it from me. But as I picked up my phone and thought about passing this problem on to someone else, I hesitated. It felt wrong. I couldn't just hand this thing off without explaining what it did. And who would believe me? I ended up not making any calls. That evening, I stood in front of it again. I said out loud, "I don't know what you are, but I'm not afraid of you." My voice shook. I'm not sure why I said that. I guess I was trying to convince myself. Another week went by with the same nightly routine. I set alarms on my phone, but I always woke up before they rang. My body was on high alert. Each midnight, I witnessed the same bizarre show. Some nights the voices sounded closer. Other nights they were distant, like they were traveling through a long tunnel. One evening I tried calling a friend to come over and see it, but he couldn't make it that late. I didn't push him. I wasn't sure if having someone else in the house would help or make it worse. Finally, I tracked down more information about Vogel through a local historical society. They had a file on him that included references to his private journals. The text described how he believed these sound gates allowed contact with beings that existed outside normal perception. He wrote about them as if they were always present, just waiting for a channel. I felt a knot in my stomach when I read that. I thought about the phonograph and how it seemed to operate on its own schedule. Right now, the phonograph sits in my living room. I don't try to move it anymore. I accept that every midnight it will do its thing. I've recorded hours of attempts, but all I get is strange static. I can't explain it to myself in a way that makes sense. I can only describe what I've witnessed. It plays music without any visible energy source, and those voices speak in a language I can't identify. I can feel my heart pounding each night when the clock hits midnight. I stand there, listening, waiting for that uneasy feeling to pass. It never quite does, but I can't walk away from it either. I don't know if these voices are real or if they're part of some trick my mind is playing. I keep thinking about Vogel and his experiments. I think he actually created something beyond normal technology. I sense that every time the voices echo through that old horn, something is watching or listening. I feel it in the way my nerves jangle and my pulse races. I don't see shapes or shadows, but I sense a presence. I've considered throwing it away, but I can't bring myself to do it. A small part of me wants to understand what's going on. Another part is just scared of what would happen if I tried to destroy it. Would it matter? So I wait. Every night, I wait for that faint rumble in the horn. I feel my muscles tense. I hear the turntable start. Even though there's no working spring, I hear those voices fill my living room, chanting in that strange tongue. And then, after it stops, I lie awake, sweating, staring at the ceiling until morning. That's my life now. I never expected a simple auction to lead me here, but it did. I'm a collector, and I found the wrong piece. Or maybe it found me. Either way, I'm stuck with it, and I have no idea where it will take me next. All I know is that at midnight, I'll be listening, and every night those voices will return. I walked into the lobby around 7 in the evening, feeling sore from the drive and ready to unload my samples. I had several meetings lined up for the next day, so I figured I'd check in, find my room, catch a quick shower before preparing my notes. The outside of the hotel looked older than expected. The bricks were chipped in places, and the sign over the entrance flickered on and off. I didn't really care. I just wanted a clean room and a quiet place to rest. The clerk at the front desk seemed distant. He handed me a key and a small folded map of the hotel floors. He said my room would be on the second floor at the end of the corridor, then turned away like he didn't want to keep talking. I carried my suitcase to the elevator. The doors rattled when they opened. The interior smelled like old carpet and cleaning chemicals. I hit the button for the second floor and stood there, tapping my shoe on the cracked tile. The elevator stopped with a jolt. I stepped out and immediately noticed the hallway lights flickering. The carpet had a pattern of swirling green and brown shapes that looked worn in places, like 1,000 shoes had passed through over many years. The corridor felt long. It stretched in both directions, but I saw a sign indicating my room would be to the right, so I headed that way. I noticed something strange as I started walking. The door numbers on my right were 2000. Each pair seemed consistent, but after a while I glanced back at the last door I passed and realized it also said. I wondered if I was just tired. I checked my key, which said the map indicated it would be near the end of the corridor. I kept walking, but the hall didn't seem to end. The layout stayed the same. Doors on the right, doors on the left, all with numbers in a pattern. The lights hummed overhead. My shoes sank into the carpet as I moved forward, and each step felt heavier than the last. I decided to count the door numbers to see if I could spot, but each time I approached a door in the 2020s or 230s, the next one would suddenly drop back down to 20 or jump ahead. I felt annoyed at first, then a trickle of unease crawled up my spine. I stopped in the middle of the corridor and looked around. The walls had antique wallpaper with subtle vertical stripes. One of the frames on the wall showed a mountain landscape with bright blue skies. I noticed that the sky in the painting had a slight greenish tint, which seemed off. I remembered it as blue just a second earlier. I took out the folded map the clerk gave me. It showed the elevator at one end, a straight hallway, and a simple sequence of rooms from 20. There was a small note that said stairs at the end of corridor. I looked up, tried to see the far end. The corridor seemed to go on forever. The lights flickered again, and I heard a faint buzzing. I also heard a muffled sound from somewhere behind one of the doors, like a television left on low volume. I walked another minute, trying to keep track of each door number. The sequence made no sense. Sometimes I saw 2T5 repeated twice in a row. Sometimes the same door number on both sides of the corridor. I twisted the doorknob of a door labeled 205 just to see if it would open. It was locked. The next door, 336, was also locked. My heart thumped in my chest, and my mouth went dry. I wiped my forehead, realizing I was sweating even though the temperature in the hallway felt slightly cool. I checked my watch. It said 7. I figured I'd been on this floor for at least 10 minutes. It made no sense that I hadn't found my room or reached a dead end. The map clearly showed a short corridor. I decided to turn around and go back to the elevator. I walked in the opposite direction for what felt like 5 minutes, but never saw the elevator doors. The corridor kept going with the same pattern of doors and lights. I caught a glimpse of that same mountain painting on the wall. I touched the frame to be sure it wasn't my imagination. The glass felt cold and the frame felt a bit loose. I moved my finger across the mountain range in the painting. The mountain peaks looked gray now, and the sky had a faint purple hue. My breathing sped up. I realized something was very wrong here. I stepped back and tried the next door I saw. It said. I jiggled the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I knocked and called out, "Hello? Anyone inside?" No one answered. I thought I heard a faint voice behind the door, but it might have been the hum of the lights. I moved on to the door across the hallway. 222 locked as well. I continued forward, passing 222, 224, 225. The numbers repeated again. 222. I started feeling lightheaded. I crouched down and unzipped my suitcase, looking for a bottle of water. My hands were shaking a bit as I twisted the cap. I drank half the bottle, trying to catch my breath. I decided to keep going and try every door. Maybe I'd find someone in one of the rooms, or maybe I'd find a door that opened. I tried about 10 doors in a row, all locked. Some had tiny mail slots, and I heard faint noises through them, whispers or radio static. I left them alone and kept walking. At some point I checked my watch again. It showed. I realized I'd spent half an hour in that corridor, and I felt no closer to anything. My eyes started to blur from staring at the repeated patterns, and each step on that soft carpet made my legs ache. I took out the map again. It still showed a simple layout. I tapped on it with my finger. This makes no sense, I whispered to myself. I tried to think logically. Maybe I was on the wrong floor, but I specifically pressed the button for the second floor. Then I considered the possibility of an error in the building signage, but the repeating doors, the corridor that never ended, felt impossible. I pressed my hand against the wall. The wallpaper felt rough. The wall itself felt solid. I ran my hand along it as I walked, hoping to find a hidden door or notch. Nothing. The lights overhead buzzed, and one bulb near me flickered. I also noticed a slight stretch in the walls. As if the corridor expanded for a moment, it snapped back. When I blinked a few times, my stomach turned. I forced myself to keep moving, focusing on breathing. Time passed in a blur. I tried to keep track of the door numbers, but they started to repeat in random sequences. I'd see 2030, then suddenly 2031, then 2032, and again 230, followed by... My watch showed 8 into 10. I realized an hour had passed. My legs were shaking, my back ached, and I was dragging my suitcase with me, which felt heavier and heavier. I tried setting it down for a moment, but couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. I needed my clothes and product samples. At some point, I came across a door marked. I fumbled with my key, hoping it would open this door. I felt my heartbeat pound in my ears. The key slid in, but wouldn't turn. I tugged on the handle. The handle jiggled, but the lock didn't budge. I cursed under my breath and leaned my forehead against the door. I pressed my ear to the wood and heard a distant chattering noise. It sounded like someone talking, but I couldn't make out any words. I pulled back, angry and frustrated. I walked another few steps, saw 237 again. I tried that one too, same issue. The key went in, but it wouldn't turn. My hands shook with frustration. I felt a sense of panic rising in my chest. I tried not to break down. I swallowed hard and tried to keep a cool head. I tested every door with the 27 number on it. Eventually, I lost count of how many times I saw that number. Around what my watch said was 8:45, I heard a new sound. It came from behind a door labeled 240. It was a muffled cry or moan. I wasn't sure. My scalp prickled. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. I listened for a while. The sound stopped, replaced by a soft humming. I gave up and walked further. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around. The corridor looked empty. No one stood there. I noticed the flickering lights overhead. My palms were clammy. My pulse pounded in my neck. I started walking faster. I saw the same painting again. The one with the mountains. The mountains looked brown, and the sky had turned almost red. I reached out and tapped the glass. It vibrated slightly. I swallowed. My tongue felt dry. My head pounded. I turned a corner I swore hadn't been there before. The corridor shifted, leading me to a small alcove with a single door that said... I tried the handle. It turned. I pushed the door open and stepped through. Instead of a normal hotel room, I found a large empty hall. The floor was polished wood, and the ceiling had old-fashioned light fixtures that glowed softly, casting strange shadows on the floor. Rows of suitcases stood against the walls. Some were modern with wheels and telescopic handles, while others were old, made of leather with worn straps. A few had tags attached. I looked around, waiting for someone to appear, but the hall was silent, except for a soft hum coming from the lights. The air smelled like stale perfume and dust. I set my suitcase down and walked among the abandoned bags. I touched one of the older suitcases. The leather felt cracked and stiff. I looked at the name tag on it, but it was smudged and impossible to read. I opened a few to see if they held any clues, but most were either empty or filled with random items like clothes, shoes, or toiletry bags. There were dozens of suitcases. I noticed they looked like they'd been left in a hurry, as if their owners never came back to collect them. I felt my skin crawl. I didn't see any sign of people. No chairs, no tables, no windows. Just walls and those abandoned suitcases. My breathing quickened. I tried to calm down by focusing on practical things. I checked my phone to see if I could get a signal, but there was none. The screen showed 0 bars. I walked to the far end of the hall, found another door. It was locked from the inside. The handle turned, but the door stayed shut like it was blocked. I rattled it. Nothing happened. I went back to the main entrance of the hall and propped it open with a small suitcase. I didn't want the door to close behind me. Then I walked around the perimeter of the hall, tapping on walls, looking for a seam or a hidden exit. Nothing. My heart raced. My eyes darted around, expecting someone to jump out. But the place was silent. The light fixtures buzzed occasionally and dust particles floated in the air. I tried calling out, "Is anyone here?" My voice echoed. No one answered. I stood there breathing heavily, trying to decide what to do. The corridor behind me led to more confusion, but at least it was open. This hall felt like a dead end. Yet, it had all these suitcases. It made me think that other people had tried to find a way out, left their luggage, and disappeared. That thought made my skin prickle with sweat. I shook my head, trying to stay focused on the present moment. I picked up my suitcase, walked back into the corridor, retrieved the small suitcase I used to hold the door open, and closed it behind me. The door shut on its own, with a soft click. I tested it one more time from the corridor side, locked again. I couldn't open it. I took a deep breath, then started walking down the hall in hopes of finding the elevator or a stairwell. I told myself there had to be a way out. I wasn't interested in going deeper into that place. I just wanted the front desk, my car, or even the sidewalk outside. As I walked, I passed the same repeating numbers again. I heard distant voices behind some doors. I kept trying to open them, but they all stayed locked. My watch read no. I felt exhausted. My shirt stuck to my back. My throat felt parched, and I only had half a bottle of water left. The corridor lights never dimmed or brightened. They just stayed in a constant flicker. Every time I turned my head, I thought I saw the hallway stretch or bend. My eyes burned from trying to make sense of it. At some point I stopped by a door labeled 2037 that had a slight scratch on the metal. I recognized the scratch. I remember brushing against it earlier with my suitcase. I slid the key in, and this time the lock clicked. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt a rush of hope. I turned the knob and opened the door. Inside, I found nothing but a cramped storage closet. There was a single overhead light bulb, and it barely worked. The space was empty except for a broken chair and a cleaning bucket. I ran my hand over the walls inside. They were solid, with no hidden door. I slammed the door shut, let out a shaky breath, and dragged my feet back into the hallway. I heard a sudden scraping noise from somewhere behind me. I froze. The noise stopped. I turned, but the corridor was empty. My skin tingled. My ears strained for any sound. Nothing. I quickened my pace. The corridor seemed longer than before. I gripped the handle of my suitcase until my knuckles turned white. I told myself I'd keep moving until I found some sign of life, an exit, or something that made sense. I checked door after door, but everything stayed locked. The corridor smelled like dust and old carpet. The hum of the lights felt constant and irritating. I looked at the painting again. The mountains were almost black now, and the sky looked muddy. I tried not to stare at it. Something about the slow change in the painting made me want to scream. Time slipped by in bursts. I walked, tried doors, heard strange voices, and sometimes I thought I saw shadows move beneath the door frames. I knocked, but no one answered. My stomach growled. My body felt stiff. My feet hurt. My watch showed 9:50, then 10:00. I felt the urge to throw the map away, but I kept it anyway, folding and unfolding it, hoping it would somehow make sense. Eventually, I realized I was back near the door labeled 29, the one that led to that big hall of suitcases. I recognized the small alcove. They had gone in a circle. I tried the handle again. It opened. The hall was still empty. All the suitcases were still there, lined up against the walls. I paused in the doorway, staring at those abandoned bags. The overhead lights hummed. I felt trapped. I didn't know if I should stay there or return to the corridor. My heart pounded like a drum. I had no idea how to escape. I stood there breathing in short gasps. The door half opened behind me. The flicker of the lights in the corridor cast a jittery glow on the abandoned suitcases. They looked like silent witnesses to whatever was happening in this place. I rolled my suitcase to a corner and sat on it. My legs trembled and my shirt was damp with sweat. I wanted to scream for help, but was too tired. I just sat there staring at the empty hall, feeling the weight of the silence. My eyes darted from one suitcase to the next, hoping I'd see someone emerge, but no one came. I don't know how long I sat there listening to the buzz of the lights. I felt numb. I heard only my own breathing and that endless electrical hum. When I finally stood up, I walked back into the corridor, leaving the hall behind. That's when I noticed the number on the nearest door again. I stared at my key, took a deep breath, and slid it into the lock, wondering if this time it would lead somewhere else. My heart hammered in my chest. I turned the key and heard a click. Then I opened the door, not sure if I wanted to see another empty closet or if this time I'd finally find a way out. I had heard rumors about the place for years. The monastery's name showed up in old archive notes and private letters I'd uncovered during my research on medieval religious orders. People whispered about silent bells, a chilly atmosphere that lingered in the corridors, and a mysterious event that caused everything to change there long ago. I wanted to know more. I pushed for official permission to visit. After a lot of bureaucracy, I finally got the green light. I arrived early in the morning feeling confident about my mission. I was expecting cold stone floors, dusty manuscripts, and maybe a few bored caretakers, but I did not expect the strange silence that settled on me from the moment I stepped through the gates. The caretaker, an older man with a tired expression, greeted me at the entrance. He handed me a brass key and said I could explore most areas, except for any doors that were locked. I asked about the bells. He avoided my eyes and mumbled that the bells hadn't rung in a very long time. Then he told me he would be in his small office if I had questions. Before I could reply, he walked away and disappeared around a corner. The echo of his footsteps faded quickly. I noticed a draft coming from somewhere, even though it was the middle of summer. I zipped my jacket and adjusted my backpack. The walls, covered in faded carvings, seemed to absorb the light. My footsteps sounded loud against the stone floor. The corridors stretched out in several directions. Some led to abandoned cells, others to storage rooms, and at least two seemed to go in the direction of the cloister. I decided to start with the main hallway, which had stone arches overhead. The place smelled like old books, damp stone, and a hint of something metallic. I ran my fingers along the walls, feeling the grooves. The temperature felt lower than outside, as if the sun didn't penetrate these holes. I heard a faint drip of water in the distance. There was no sign of the caretaker. I moved slowly, checking each open door. Some rooms had bare wooden tables and benches. Others stored crates filled with rotting cloth, while a few boxes held rusted tools. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary yet. I looked up at the ceiling and noticed patterns of cracks. The building felt ancient, as if it had been here for centuries without much maintenance. My breath felt steady, but I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. It wasn't a paranoid feeling, more like an awareness that the walls had seen things I couldn't comprehend. I took notes in a small journal, describing the corridors, the condition of the rooms, and any details about the architecture that might be relevant. Around noon, I reached the central courtyard. It had a small garden in the middle, with overgrown weeds and a broken fountain. The air was still cold. I couldn't see the sun, even though the sky was clear above. It was unsettling. I looked up at the bell tower that rose on one side of the courtyard. The bells were there, 3 of them made of dark metal. They didn't move. I wondered about the legend that said they never rang again after some ritual went wrong. The caretaker's words echoed in my mind. He hadn't offered any explanation, just seemed scared of the topic. I ate a quick lunch from my backpack and decided to look for the library or archives. The caretaker had mentioned that some old texts might be in a large chamber near the northern wing. I followed a corridor that grew progressively narrower. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows. A few doors appeared locked, so I moved on. At the end of the hallway, I found a large double door made of reinforced wood. It had decorative iron hinges and a big padlock. Next to it was a smaller door with a broken lock. I slipped inside. The room contained rows of shelves filled with manuscripts, scrolls, and books. Dust rose as I walked. My nose tickled, and I sneezed. Everything smelled like mildew. I looked around for a catalog or index. Several shelves had rotted, so some documents lay in disarray on the floor. I brushed off dirt and picked up a few scrolls. They were in Latin with strange symbols in the margins. I made out references to purification rites, an old brotherhood, and instructions about chanting certain phrases at specific times of the year. I didn't see direct mention of the bells, but I had a feeling these texts might be connected. I snapped a few pictures with my phone. The camera flash reflected off the parchment. As evening approached, I realized I'd been alone the entire day. The caretaker was nowhere in sight, and nobody else seemed to be around. I walked back toward the central courtyard. The light outside was dimming, and the air felt even colder than before. I saw the bell tower again. The bells looked the same, motionless. I decided to find my assigned sleeping quarters. The caretaker had told me I could use one of the old guest rooms upstairs. The stone stairway twisted to the second floor. Each step made a scraping sound under my shoes. When I reached the top, I located a row of small doors. Most were unlocked, but they were empty inside. One door had a cot with a thin mattress and a heavy wool blanket. There was a single window overlooking the courtyard. I dropped my backpack on the floor and tested the bed. It squeaked, but it was sturdy enough. I took a moment to organize my notes and set my flashlight on a small table. It was silent. No wind, no night birds, nothing. I thought about searching for the caretaker to see if there was a kitchen, but exhaustion hit me. I decided to try to sleep and continue exploring in the morning. I must have dozed off for a while because the next thing I remember is waking up to a faint ringing noise. My eyes snapped open. My heart pounded. I looked at the window. It was dark outside. The room felt colder than ever. I heard the distinct sound of bells, slow and steady, like a distant chime. But it didn't sound like it was coming from outside. It sounded muffled, as if coming through stone walls. I reached for my flashlight and got up. I looked out the window. The bells in the tower were still. They weren't moving. The courtyard was empty. The sky was clear. Yet the sound continued soft, rhythmic, like it was calling me. A chill ran down my back. My hands trembled, but I had to investigate. I opened the door, stepped into the corridor, and listened. The ringing echoed somewhere to my left, deeper inside the building. I followed it. My footsteps felt heavy. I tried to keep quiet, but the old floors creaked beneath me. The corridor led me past empty rooms with open doors. I noticed that the chill got stronger the further I walked. My breath came out in small clouds now, like I was standing in a freezer. I turned a corner and saw a narrow staircase leading down. The bells got a bit louder, still faint but more insistent. I descended step by step. My flashlight illuminated chipped stone walls and damp patches. The smell of mildew intensified. The ringing was clearer now. I came to a locked wooden door. Its surface looked warped, and the handle was iron. I tested it. It was locked. But as soon as I pulled my hand away, I heard another sound behind me, like a low creak. I turned around and saw a faint glint on the floor. It was a key. I picked it up. My heart raced. I had no idea who dropped it or how it got there. I tried it in the lock. It fit perfectly. The door swung open with a groan. The bell sound stopped. I found myself in a small room with stone shelves built into the walls. Dozens of manuscripts, parchment, and old books cluttered the place. A single torch holder was mounted to the wall, empty. The air was stale. My flashlight caught glimpses of odd symbols on the manuscripts. I set the flashlight on a shelf so I could open one of the books. It contained pages describing something called a purification ritual. It talked about chanting phrases, lighting candles, and wearing specific vestments. There were instructions about aligning times and dates. I recognized references to Latin phrases I'd seen earlier. My adrenaline spiked. The text mentioned bells, referring to them as a signal to start the ceremony. It said that if the prior steps were completed, the bells would sound without being physically struck. I heard a quiet ringing again. It seemed to come from behind the walls. The same melodic pattern. My stomach tightened. My chest felt heavy. My legs shook slightly. My head pounded with questions. Was I triggering something by reading this? I flipped through more pages. The instructions got more detailed. There were diagrams of robed figures standing in a circle, holding candles. Notes about purity of the mind, body, and spirit were included. No mention of harm to anyone was made. but it was all very specific. I felt an urge to understand it better, as if the text was urging me to complete what had been started long ago. I gathered a few of the manuscripts and tried to go back the way I came. I climbed the staircase, turned corners, looked for the corridor that led to my room, but the layout seemed different. I tried a couple of doors, but they were locked. The bells started up again, faint but clear. I felt panic building. My pulse pounded in my ears. I told myself to stay calm and focus. I'd been in many old buildings with confusing layouts. I moved methodically, checking each hallway, feeling the stone walls, trying to locate the stairs that led to my room. Every path ended in a locked door or looped me back to corridors that felt unfamiliar. The tension in my chest got worse. My palms were sweaty, and my breathing was shallow. I paused near a window that overlooked the courtyard. I saw the tower in the moonlight. The bells were motionless. The cold draft passed by, making the hair on my arms stand up. I tried to open the window, but it was stuck. The frame felt like it hadn't been opened in ages. I looked down into the courtyard. It was empty and silent. Then I noticed something. The caretaker was standing near the fountain, looking up. I banged on the glass and shouted. He didn't react. I banged again. He looked toward me for a second, but his expression was unreadable. He walked into the shadows without a word. I felt a wave of frustration. I couldn't figure out why he would ignore me. I decided to retrace my steps to the library. Maybe from there I could find the main exit. I reached the double door with iron hinges, but this time it was locked. The padlock was different, newer, like someone had replaced it. I yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge. I tried to calm myself. My throat was dry. I took a sip of water from my canteen, which was barely half full now. I had to find a way out, but every turn led to another locked door or hallway that didn't match my memory of the place. The bells sounded again, a little louder than before. My heart rate jumped. I followed the sound because I didn't have many other options. It led me back down a different staircase. At the bottom, I found another door. This one was slightly ajar. I stepped inside and saw a larger chamber. It had a stone floor covered in dust. A heavy wooden table stood at the center, with candles placed around it. They looked old and unused for ages, but there was no dust on them. My flashlight revealed more scripts piled on the table. I recognized the same symbols from earlier. I started reading. It was another version of the purification ritual with instructions about certain items needed. A chalice, a bowl of water, and something about incense. I noticed these objects were scattered around the table. A dull chalice, a small bowl, and a broken incense holder. A short note next to them explained that the final step had never been completed. It said the bells would remain silent until the ritual was finished, but the text implied that the bell's silence was forced. Yet I was hearing them. My hands shook as I placed the manuscripts in my backpack, thinking maybe I could continue this research later. Then the bells rang more intensely, a clear sequence of tones. My chest tightened again. I felt a strong urge to do something to complete the steps. Part of me argued that it was a bad idea. Another part of me felt that the only way out might be to cooperate with whatever presence or energy lingered here. I found a door at the back of the chamber. It opened without resistance and led to another hallway I hadn't seen before. The walls were lined with old tapestries, rotted and frayed. The air smelled of damp cloth and wax. My heartbeat pounded as I walked, half expecting the caretaker to appear. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. At the end of the hall I found a larger door. It had a rusted handle. I pulled on it. It opened to the main entrance foyer, where I recognized the large wooden doors that led outside. Finally, I thought I was free. I rushed to the exit, but the doors wouldn't open. I turned the handle again and again, but it was stuck. I pushed, pulled, even kicked. They were sealed. I looked around the foyer for another way out. Windows were too high to reach. The caretaker's office was closed, so I tried that door. It was locked. I banged on it, but there was no response. The bells tolled again, echoing in my ears. My hands were clammy, and my shoulders felt tight. A heavy sensation settled in my stomach. I needed to find another route. I hurried back into the hallway, passing the tapestries, then turned left into a corridor I hadn't explored yet. It led me to a small room with benches along the walls. There was a door marked with an old symbol. It was the same symbol from the ritual texts, something about cleansing. I turned the handle. It opened. Inside there was a stone basin filled with stale water. The temperature in the room felt even colder than the rest of the monastery. My breath was ragged. My mind raced. The bells rang once more, louder. Each ring vibrated in my chest. My instincts told me that the only way out was to finish what was left undone centuries ago. The manuscripts had described a ritual that involved water, a chalice, incense, and a series of chants. I had all those items. They were in my backpack and in the other chamber. Maybe that was the key. I didn't want to do it, but I had no alternative. The monastery wouldn't let me leave. Every door was locked, and the caretaker was gone. I felt stuck. My body trembled with tension. I returned to the chamber with the table, gathering the chalice, the small bowl, and the incense holder. I filled the chalice with water from the basin. I placed the items on the table exactly as the instructions said. I took out the manuscripts. Each page described a short phrase in Latin. I tried to pronounce them. My voice echoed in the cold chamber. Nothing happened at first. I lit the incense, though it smelled weak. I repeated the words. A faint breeze circled around me. The bells chimed again, but this time I felt the vibration in my bones. My scalp tingled. My teeth chattered. I moved through each step, following the instructions word for word as directly as I could manage. My mouth was dry, my knees felt shaky, and I had a growing headache behind my eyes. But I kept going. The final part mentioned ringing a small handbell. I looked around and sure enough, there was a tiny bell on a shelf. I picked it up. It was dusty.
I wiped it with my sleeve.
According to the text, the final action was to ring it 3 times at the exact end of the chant. I repeated the chant, heart-hammering, and rang the bell once, twice, 3 times. The sound was quiet yet sharp. Then I heard the big bells resonate from the tower above, loud and clear, as if echoing my handbell. I braced myself, expecting something dramatic, but the only thing I noticed was that the cold air started to dissipate. My breath no longer condensed in front of me. The ringing from the tower faded until there was complete silence again. I wiped sweat from my forehead. My legs felt weak. I opened the chamber door and made my way to the foyer. The main doors yielded this time. They creaked, and I felt a burst of warm air from outside. Morning light spilled in. I stepped out onto the front steps and inhaled fresh air. My chest loosened, and my headache began to ease. I looked back at the bell tower. The bells hung there completely still as always. I had no explanation for the sounds or the locked doors or the caretaker's strange behavior. I just knew I was finally free to leave. I walked down the path toward my car, which was parked beyond the monastery walls. The caretaker was nowhere in sight. I realized my phone's battery was almost dead. I had photos of the manuscripts, which was all I needed to prove that something was going on there. My legs felt like lead, but I kept moving. I started the engine, feeling a sensation of relief wash over me. I drove away from that old building, unsure of the true nature of the events I had experienced, but certain that the bells, no matter how silent they appeared, had never truly stopped ringing. I knew I would never forget the sound that guided me through those stone corridors, and I knew I would always be haunted by the memory of being trapped in that cold space, forced to complete a forgotten ritual just to escape. I always thought my building was just old and creaky. I never imagined I'd see something in the middle of the night that would make my stomach clench and my hands shake. I never thought I'd feel trapped by my own windows or my own balcony, stuck on the top floor with nowhere else to go. But that's how it started for me. Just a regular evening, me leaning on the railing and looking at the moon when I saw this shape across the way. It wore a dark hat and seemed to watch me. I froze. I felt my heart pound and I couldn't take my eyes off it. But a second later it vanished. I moved into this place about 6 months ago. I'm a normal guy. I keep to myself most of the time. I like to read. I don't go to many parties, and I'm not the type to start rumors or believe in weird stories. The building is old, though. It's got iron railings with chipped paint in the stairwell, and a faint smell of stale air. My apartment is on the top floor, and my balcony faces another section of the building. In the daytime, there's not much to see, just bricks and a few windows. At night, though, the entire place feels different. That first night I saw the figure. It was just standing there on the balcony across from mine. I didn't see a face or any details, just that outline with a hat having a curved brim. I stared. My mouth went dry. The figure didn't move at first, but I sensed it was looking straight at me. I wanted to yell, but my voice just caught in my throat. Then it disappeared behind the balcony door. I went back inside and walked around my living room, trying to calm down. I told myself maybe it was just a neighbor I hadn't noticed before, but I knew that apartment was empty. The landlord had told me it had been vacant for years. I thought maybe a squatter had broken in. I tried to rationalize it, but my body felt tense. I locked my balcony door and double-checked my windows. That night I slept on my couch with the lights on. The next day, I passed by the landlord's office on the ground floor. I casually asked if anyone had moved into the unit across from mine. He gave me a blank look and said no. No one wanted to rent that place apparently. Something about water damage and old structural issues. I didn't push further. I just felt this heavy knot in my chest. I left the conversation feeling unsettled. That evening, I hesitated before looking out my balcony door. My heart was beating too fast. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, but around midnight, I couldn't resist. I stepped outside. The cool air hit my face, and I looked around. It was quiet. There was nothing on that balcony. No movement at all. I watched for a few minutes, then went back in. I felt a bit of relief. Later that night, I woke up to a strange tapping sound at my window. It sounded like someone was lightly knocking, but I live on the top floor. There's no fire escape near my windows. My skin tingled, and I sat up in bed. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I inched toward the window, trying not to make noise. I peeked through the curtains. Nobody was there. I felt this rush of anxiety in my stomach. I made sure the window was locked, then stood there for a while, listening. Silence. The following morning, I tried to forget about it. I went to work, did my routine stuff, and came home. My apartment was quiet as usual, but I felt on edge. I checked the balcony door again and looked down at the street. Everything seemed normal. I tried to watch a movie, but I couldn't relax. Around midnight, I heard that tapping again. This time it was louder, like knuckles on glass. I jumped off my couch and hurried to the window. When I opened the curtain, nothing, just darkness. My reflection looked back at me, tense and pale. I went to the balcony door and carefully pulled it open. The night air felt colder than usual. I looked toward the opposite balcony, and that's when I saw it again. The figure with the hat. It stood on the ledge facing me. My mouth dried up, and my legs felt weak. The figure didn't move for a moment, but I felt it staring. Then it stepped back out of view. My heart hammered. I heard a faint clank like metal against metal, and then everything went silent. In the morning, I noticed a small object on my balcony's concrete floor. I picked it up. It looked like an old key, rusted around the edges. I had no idea where it came from. I walked to the railing and glanced over at the other balcony. The door there was closed and everything looked abandoned. No sign of life. I tried to convince myself that maybe someone dropped the key from a window above. But I live on the top floor. There's no apartment above me. That night I lay in bed, determined not to let my imagination run wild. But around 2 in the morning, I heard the tapping again. It was faster and more insistent. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I moved to the window, my breath coming in quick bursts. I touched the glass. The tapping stopped. My hand trembled as I slid the curtain aside. Nothing. I let out a shaky exhale. Then I heard a dull thud on the balcony. I rushed out, phone light shining. My foot bumped into something on the ground. It was a small metal toy car, or at least what was left of it. It was covered in rust. One of the wheels was missing. I picked it up and felt flakes of rusty metal crumble onto my palm. I set it on the railing, trying to figure out where it came from. I looked over at that other balcony. At first I saw nothing, then caught a glimpse of movement behind the glass door across the way. It was that figure again, stepping back into the shadows. Over the next few nights, more objects appeared. A bent spoon with rust all over it, a broken watch face, and a small pair of glasses frames without lenses. Each time they showed up right after I heard knocks or taps at my window. I could feel my anxiety building. My chest felt tight, and my sleep was terrible. Every time the sun set, I started anticipating the noise. My neck and shoulders stayed tense. I tried talking to one of my neighbors down the hall, who'd been in the building longer than me. I asked if he knew anything about that vacant apartment, or if he'd seen anyone around. He shrugged and said no. He mentioned hearing odd creaks at night, but we agreed that's normal in an old place. I didn't bring up the objects because I didn't want to sound crazy. The building's maintenance guy was painting a stairwell a few days later, and I stopped to chat. He confirmed that apartment had been empty for a long time. He joked that he sometimes heard weird noises from there, but he chalked it up to old pipes. He had never seen anyone coming in or out. I nodded, forcing a nervous smile. By the second week, the tapping at my window changed into more forceful knocks. I would jump out of bed, heart pounding, and rush to the window. Every time I'd see nothing. Then, on my balcony, there'd be another rusted trinket. The objects kept piling up. I started collecting them in a small box. There was no logical reason for any of this. My apartment is on the highest floor. There's no easy way for someone to reach my windows or my balcony. Yet these items kept appearing, and the figure across the way seemed to be leaving them. One night, I decided I'd stay up and keep watch. I brewed strong coffee and sat in the dark with my lights off. I kept my curtains parted just enough to see my balcony. Around 2 a.m., I spotted movement on that vacant balcony. I leaned forward, straining my eyes. The silhouette stood on the railing. My entire body went rigid. Then it leaped across to another balcony, then another, moving closer to mine, one balcony at a time. The sound of shoes hitting metal railings echoed in the quiet night. My breathing turned shallow. I felt lightheaded. I wanted to call the police, but something stopped me. I was scared they'd think I was imagining things. Instead, I just watched. The figure reached the balcony next to mine. I heard a metallic scrape, and I saw a dark shape crouch near the rails. My hands shook. I didn't dare move. After a few seconds, the shape vanished. I sat there, heart pounding until dawn broke. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning I had a rusty old lighter on my windowsill. I swallowed hard and placed it with the other items. I called the landlord again, asking if he could check that apartment or maybe change the locks. He said he didn't have time that week but would see about it later. He didn't sound too concerned. I could feel frustration boiling in my chest. I hung up, feeling alone in this. Another night, I heard a scraping noise at my balcony door. It was around 3. I jumped out of bed, nearly tripping over my own feet. I rushed to the living room. The door handle rattled. I flicked on the lights. The rattling stopped. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I stood about 10 feet from the door, phone in hand. But I didn't call anyone. I just waited. Then I saw a shape move away from the door. It hopped onto the railing, balanced there for a second, and I heard a low grunt like a soft exhale. My stomach lurched. The figure leaped onto the next balcony over. I watched it land silently. My legs felt numb. The figure slipped into the darkness again. I collapsed onto my couch, sweating. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to sneak over to that vacant apartment during the day. The landlord sometimes leaves the master keys in the maintenance office, which is usually unlocked when the maintenance guy is around. I waited for the perfect moment. Around noon, I found the office empty. I grabbed the master key ring, my heart racing. I knew this was risky, but I had to figure out what was going on. I took the stairs up to that apartment. The hallway lights flickered. The door looked warped and old. I took a breath and tried the key. It fit. I pushed the door open. It smelled like dust and old wood. The living room was empty, except for a few broken chairs. I saw a short hallway that led to a bedroom. I moved slowly, stepping over rotted floorboards. My footsteps echoed. When I reached the bedroom, I found a closet door with a jar inside. There were shelves with old newspapers, a few boxes, and a bunch of random junk. Most of it was rusty or broken. My mind raced. These things looked like the objects I'd been receiving on my balcony. Bent spoons, old keys, torn bits of fabric, and more. I felt a rush of adrenaline. This had to be the source. I checked the balcony door of that apartment. It was stuck. I had to push hard to open it. Outside, the railing was dusty and covered with flakes of old paint. I saw footprints in the dust. My throat went dry again. Someone had definitely been out here, jumping between balconies. It wasn't a ghost or some trick of my imagination. Someone was physically doing this. I didn't find any sign of who it was, though. No bag of rusted items waiting to be delivered. No bed or sleeping bag. It was like they came in and out without a trace. I felt exposed, standing there on the balcony. Anyone could watch me from another building. I pulled the door shut, left everything as I found it, and locked up. My hands shook as I returned the master keys. I felt like I had pried into something I shouldn't have. That night, I tried to keep calm. I told myself that whoever was doing this was just messing around. But around midnight, I heard loud knocks on my balcony door. It sounded urgent. I froze. My arms tingled with fear. I took a few steps toward the door. The knocks continued, then paused, and more knocks followed. I yanked the curtains open. The silhouette was right on the other side of the glass, face still hidden by a hat. I couldn't see any details. I just saw a shape pressed against the door. My pulse skyrocketed. I stared, unsure what to do. The figure reached up and pointed toward the handle. My mind went blank. I backed away, shaking my head. Then, in one swift movement, the figure jumped onto the railing and was gone. I heard a faint scraping sound from the neighboring balcony. Then nothing.
I didn't sleep that night.
In the morning, there was another rusted object on my balcony. It looked like a pocket knife, half open. The blade was covered in rust. I grabbed it, tossed it in the box, and locked everything again. I sat on my couch for a long time, trying to catch my breath. The tension in my body wouldn't leave. I felt shaky and my head pounded. Later that day, I went downstairs and asked the landlord again to check the place. He seemed impatient, saying something about making an appointment, and brushed me off. I demanded that he come up right now and see the footprints on that vacant balcony. He said he was busy. I felt angry but couldn't force him. I stomped back to my apartment, unsure what else to do. Each night, the figure keeps coming closer. The knocks get louder. The jumps between balconies get more frequent. I've started to dread sunset. My stomach churns every time the sky grows dark. I keep my windows locked, my balcony door secured, but the figure still appears out there, leaving something new.
I can't escape it.
I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I don't know where this is headed, or what the figure wants from me, but the objects are all connected to this building somehow. I see old labels, old address tags, and rusted keys that look like they once fit the locks here. Each item seems like a piece of the building's past. It's as if the figure is forcing me to collect them, reminding me that there's a history to this place that I can't ignore. In writing this all down, while it's still fresh in my mind, my body is tense and I keep glancing at my balcony door. It's almost midnight. I'm waiting for the knocks, taps, or whatever else is coming tonight. My palms are sweaty. My heart is beating fast. I just want this to stop, but I can't leave yet. I have a lease, and I don't have the money for another place. So I'm stuck here night after night, waiting for that shape in the hat to appear again and leave its next piece of history on my windowsill. I'm not sure how far this will go, but I know I'll be listening for those footsteps and those knocks, and I'll be watching for that silhouette on the railing across from me. I can see its eyes, but I feel its stare. I can scream for help because nobody believes me. So I sit in the darkness, wide awake, ready to hear that first tap on the glass, and I wonder if one night it will step inside. I check every floor in this building every day. That's my job. I walk through hallways, glance at doors, note any odd smells, and confirm the lights are working. It's usually routine and dull, but the 5th floor is different. I can tell as soon as I step out of the elevator. The air feels heavy. The corridor is quiet in a way that makes my skin prickle. The record shows 0 tenants on that floor, but I keep seeing signs that someone is there. A light shining under a door, a faint voice behind a wall, or a radio playing old songs down the hall. I feel watched every time I walk through. Sometimes I stand there listening and I swear something is listening back. I started this job about a year ago. The first few weeks were calm. I went floor by floor, checking the trash rooms, making sure the stairwell door locked properly, and verifying that nobody left anything in the corridors. Everything was normal for floors 1 through 4. On the 5th floor, though, I noticed a difference right away. The hallway seemed darker, even when the lights were on. Some bulbs flickered and I'd marked them for maintenance, but they stayed that way, even when I replaced them more than once. The company keeps all tenant information on a simple spreadsheet. Anyone living on any floor has to appear there. On the 5th floor, every apartment is listed as vacant. No new leases, no short-term rentals, nothing. But on my daily checks, I'd spot apartment doors slightly ajar. I'd see footprints on the dusty floor. Sometimes they were mine from the previous day, but sometimes I'd find fresh ones that didn't match my boot size. Other times I'd hear something behind a closed door. It sounded like quiet chatter, but when I stood closer, it went silent. On the first day that I realized something truly odd was going on, I had walked out of the elevator to find the hallway light flickering non-stop. At the end of the corridor, I saw a door open by a crack. I smelled some kind of strong cleaning product, almost like bleach. There was a muffled tune playing, probably from an old radio, with a slight static, the kind you get when the signal is weak. I paused and tried to listen for a second. A wave of unease hit me right in the gut. I walked toward the door, slow and quiet. I could hear my breath, ragged and uneven. My hands felt clammy. When I reached the door, I pushed it open a little. Inside was darkness and a faint glow from a small lamp. The music stopped all at once like someone had flipped a switch. I stepped inside, turned on my flashlight, and pointed it around the room. It was empty, no furniture, no sign of anyone. I checked every corner, every closet, even the bathroom. Nothing, but the smell of bleach lingered, and I thought I heard a rustle behind me once or twice. I never found the source. I reported the incident to the building manager. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. I told him about the open door, the music, the smell. He looked confused. He said nobody is supposed to be there. He even showed me the tenant list again. No one has lived on the 5th floor in years. He said maybe a worker forgot to lock up after some routine check. So I wrote it down as an odd occurrence and tried to move on. But every day the feeling got more intense. I'd step off the elevator, my heart pounding, unsure of what I would see. Sometimes the hallway was empty, the lights steady. Other times a door down the hall would be open a crack again, or I'd see a light on behind the frosted glass of an apartment window. I tried to ignore it at first, focusing on my tasks. I checked the hallway for trash, test the stairwell door, make sure the exit signs worked. But something always drew my attention back. A weird sound, a creak, a sudden drop in temperature. My scalp would tighten and my stomach would churn. I couldn't help shining my flashlight under doors, thinking maybe I'd see a pair of feet or a shadow. I never saw anyone, but I always felt like I was being observed. One night I worked late, filling in for the night shift guy. The building was quiet. Most tenants were asleep. Lights out. Around midnight, I took the elevator up to the top floor to check the roof access. I decided to stop on the 5th floor on my way down. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but I was curious about how it felt at that hour. The elevator doors opened, and the hallway was pitch dark. The overhead lights were off or broken. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust. As I stepped forward, I heard a faint humming. It sounded like a radio tuned between stations. I followed the noise to an apartment at the far end. The door was closed this time, so I pressed my ear to it. My heart pounded in my chest. I could feel the blood rushing through my ears. I tried the doorknob, it was locked. The humming continued inside. I knocked softly, and the noise stopped. I waited. 10 seconds, maybe 15. It felt like an hour. I knocked again, a bit harder. Still no answer. Then I realized I was standing there in the dark hallway alone, in front of a locked door that shouldn't have any occupant. My back felt cold, like someone was standing there watching me. My hands shook. I turned around with my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the corridor. Nothing. I gave up and left. In the following weeks, these encounters got more frequent. Sometimes, I'd find the hallway light burned out, and I'd replace it. The next day, it would be out again. I checked the fixtures, the wiring, everything. Nothing seemed wrong. I started noticing faint scratches near some of the door frames, like someone had fumbled with the lock or tried to pry the door open. But there were no reports of break-ins and no official complaints. I kept feeling like I should call the police, but I didn't have a solid reason to. It was all small stuff, easy to dismiss. Nobody was actually hurt, and nothing was stolen. So, I left it alone. But my curiosity grew. One day after lunch, I decided to do a thorough sweep of every single apartment on that floor. There were 6 units total. I had the master keys, and I'm allowed to enter if there's a maintenance reason. I reasoned that investigating unexplained lights and noises counts as a maintenance issue. I started with apartment 50. I knocked, waited, then unlocked the door and stepped in. It was empty. Dusty floors, no furniture. The walls were bare. I opened all the closets, the bathroom door, even checked inside the cabinets. Nothing there. The next unit was the same. By the time I reached the last one, 5th exits, I felt certain I'd find nothing. But I had to be thorough. The door to 506 was closed, but not locked. I turned the knob and walked in, shining my flashlight around even though the main lights worked. The place looked like someone had been there recently. The floors were cleaner than in the other apartments, and there was a single lamp plugged into the corner near the living room. It was turned off, but I noticed it was warm to the touch, like it had been on not long ago. There was a folded blanket on the floor and a half-empty water bottle next to it. I picked up the bottle. Still had some water sloshing around. I checked the label. No personal name, just a brand I recognized from the local grocery store. My mouth went dry and my stomach tensed. Someone had been in here, no question. I checked the bathroom. It was also cleaner than expected, and I saw fresh footprints on the tile. I knelt down and compared them to my shoe size. They looked smaller. I couldn't tell if it was from a man or a woman, but definitely not from me. The presence of that water bottle in the blanket made my chest tighten. I realized I wasn't alone. This wasn't just a trick of my imagination. After that, I started checking safe havens. Sometimes the door was locked, sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes the lamp was still warm. Sometimes the blanket was folded in a different spot. Once I found the lamp turned on and the water bottle replaced with a different brand. I thought about setting up a small camera, but the building manager said no. That would violate privacy rules. He said we needed proof someone was squatting before we did something like that. And he still insisted the floor was vacant. He wondered if I was stressed or tired. I told him no. I was sure about what I saw. About 2 months into this routine, I started noticing little noises outside my own office on the ground floor. At the end of my shift, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway. By the time I got up to check, no one was there. The security guards swore no one came through the doors. The camera in the lobby only showed me. I began to wonder if the person from 506 was following me. Every time I stepped onto the elevator, I felt uneasy. My breath would quicken and my hands would tremble a bit before hitting the button for the 5th floor. I'd hold my phone tight, ready to call for backup, but I never caught anyone in the act. It was always just me, standing in a hallway that felt wrong, with that stale smell of bleach sometimes, or that hum of a radio in the distance. One evening, while finishing my rounds, I heard a door slam on the 5th floor. The echo reverberated down the stairwell, so I sprinted up the steps instead of waiting for the elevator. My heart hammered in my chest and sweat dripped down my forehead. I reached the 5th floor door, pushed it open, and found the corridor dark except for one flickering overhead light. No sign of movement. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight left and right. Then I heard soft footsteps behind me. I spun around but saw nothing. My heart felt like it was beating out of my ribcage. I tried to steady my breathing. The footsteps continued, almost circling me. I couldn't pinpoint their direction. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, turning my flashlight in slow arcs, my hands shaking. Finally, the sound stopped. The hallway fell silent again. I stepped toward apartment 506, half expecting the door to be open. It was locked. I knocked. No answer. I stared at the doorknob, deciding whether to try my key. Then I heard a quiet click from inside, like someone turning off a light switch. My mouth went dry. I knocked again, more firmly. Silence. My adrenaline was high, and I felt a knot in my stomach. I grabbed the key, slid it in, and opened the door. The place was dark. I aimed my flashlight around. The blanket was gone and the lamp was still in the corner. Unplugged this time. I checked the bathroom, nothing. Checked the small closet near the entrance, empty. I even looked under the sink, feeling a bit ridiculous but determined. Whoever was in there had vanished. Every day that followed, I felt more convinced that someone was messing with me or someone was living there and didn't want to be seen. I never found evidence of violence, and I never found any official complaint from other tenants. Still, that tension in my chest grew each time I set foot on the 5th floor. I started waiting until the last part of my shift to check it, hoping daylight hours would ease my nerves. But even during the day, I sensed an odd presence. The lights would flicker, and the doors would creak. Sometimes I heard soft music playing down the hall, only to find nothing once I reached the source. One afternoon, I decided to wait inside apartment 506 for a while, just to see if anyone would come back. I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, flashlight off, phone in hand. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of electricity from the overhead light fixture. The minutes dragged. My legs felt stiff. I kept shifting my weight, listening for anything. After maybe half an hour, I heard a gentle knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. I got up silently and walked toward the door, trying not to make any noise. Another knock, soft and deliberate. I felt my palms sweating. I stood by the door, unsure if I should open it right away or wait. I decided to yank it open, hoping to catch whoever was out there. I grabbed the knob and pulled the door open fast. The hallway was empty. I stepped out, looked both ways, checked the stairwell. No one. I felt cold sweat on my neck. I'd never been so unnerved by something so small. After that, I told the building manager I had strong reasons to believe an unauthorized person was staying on the 5th floor. He said he'd come up with me the next morning. So the next day we went together. We checked every unit, including 5. Everything was as empty as could be. The manager gave me a puzzled look, as if he thought I was making it all up. We walked out, and he told me to keep him posted. I felt frustrated and helpless. I knew what I'd seen and heard, but I couldn't prove it. Over time, I realized I wasn't just looking for proof of a squatter. I was expecting to see something that would explain my sense of dread. I never found an explanation, but the floors in that corridor kept showing fresh footprints in the dust, and the hallway light kept flickering out no matter how many times I replaced it. The old radio music still played occasionally, though I could never find the radio itself. I checked every nook and cranny, every closet, every cabinet. Nothing. Now, every time I step off the elevator on the 5th floor of my stomach tightens. I grip my flashlight like a lifeline. I move quietly, keep my breathing shallow, and take it step by step. I listen for that faint humming or static-laced music, wait for a door to slam or a knob to turn. I sense someone behind me more often than not, but I never see them. I still leave that floor convinced someone is there, maybe just around the corner waiting until I go away. No matter how often I try to catch them, they slip away. I'm not sure what to do now. I can't call the police with no solid evidence. I can't get the manager to set up cameras without approval, and I can stop doing my job. So, I keep going, I keep checking, I keep feeling that presence, and I keep reminding myself not to lose my nerve. That floor is supposed to be empty, but it never feels empty. The doors keep getting left open. The lights keep turning on. The music keeps playing somewhere I can pinpoint. Every day, I walk in, half hoping I won't see anything strange, half hoping I will, because at least then I'd have answers. But I never do. I just feel that quiet tension. It's always there, pressing down on me while I finish my rounds. And every day, I walk out of that 5th floor hallway still alone, but certain that I'm not alone at all.